Welcome to the realm of your favorite horror storyteller. This video contains multiple scary stories. Be sure to watch until the very end. Should you wish to navigate between stories, time codes are provided below. Also, thank you for all your feedback and support so far. We appreciate it. Now let's get started. The excitement was in the air as Kyle, Mia, and their friends loaded up their car with camping gear, ready for their much-anticipated road trip. Kyle, with his adventurous spirit, had always been the de facto leader of their group, always seeking new, thrilling experiences. Mia, more cautious by nature, often found herself swept up in Kyle's enthusiasm, despite her better judgment. Their journey had taken them through scenic routes and popular landmarks, but it was a discovery at a quaint roadside diner that set the course for their most unforgettable adventure. Among old maps and travel guides, Kyle found a tattered brochure about Shadow Pass, a road not marked on any modern map but shrouded in urban legends and ghost stories. Mia felt a shiver down her spine as she read the brochure. "This says the pass is haunted," she said, skepticism lacing her voice. But Kyle's eyes sparkled with intrigue. "That's exactly why we should check it out. Imagine the stories we'll have." Despite Mia's reservations, the group was swayed by Kyle's enthusiasm. They set their GPS for the coordinates listed in the brochure and soon found themselves veering off the main highway onto a narrow, winding road that snaked into dense woods. As they drove deeper into Shadow Pass, an unsettling quiet descended upon the group. The road was eerily desolate, with no sign of other travelers or even wildlife. The car's radio, which had been their source of upbeat tunes, suddenly filled with static before falling silent and their phones lost all signal. The atmosphere grew heavier, the air cooler, as if the very woods around them were absorbing the warmth and sound. Shadows seemed to dance just beyond the reach of the car's headlights, and Mia thought she saw figures lurking among the trees, though they vanished when she looked directly at them. As night fell, the group decided to set up camp off the side of the road. They built a fire, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy, but the crackling flames did little to dispel the sense of foreboding that hung over them. That's when the whispers started. Indistinct at first, they seemed to emanate from the woods surrounding their campsite. The group strained to listen, but the words were elusive, slipping away as soon as they tried to focus on them. Unease turned to fear as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Then came the footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling their camp. They huddled together, eyes wide, scanning the darkness for any sign of who or what was out there. The night was filled with strange occurrences. Shadows moved at the edge of their campsite, just beyond the fire's light. Objects seemed to shift position when they weren't looking. The temperature fluctuated inexplicably, sending chills down their spines. As they lay in their tents, sleep eluded them, each sound and movement outside magnified in the stillness of the night. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching them, whispering secrets in a language they couldn't understand. Morning brought no relief, the sun struggling to penetrate the dense canopy above. They packed up their camp in silence, each lost in their thoughts about the night's eerie events. Kyle tried to lighten the mood, but even his usual bravado seemed shaken. As they continued their journey along Shadow Pass, the feeling that they were being watched grew stronger. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the landscape unchanging. It was as if they were driving into the heart of the unknown, a place forgotten by time and the outside world. And so their descent into Shadow Pass continued, each mile taking them deeper into a mystery that they were only beginning to grasp. Little did they know, the true terror of their journey had yet to reveal itself. As the road unwound beneath them, the friends' initial excitement gave way to a deepening sense of unease. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees like silent sentinels guarding secrets long forgotten. The further they drove into Shadow Pass, the more the world outside seemed distant, a memory fading into the mist. It was Marcus who first noticed the change in the air, a subtle shift that set his nerves on edge. "Does anyone else feel that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The others nodded, the atmosphere thick with anticipation and dread. The forest opened up suddenly, revealing an old town that seemed to emerge from the mists of time itself. Its buildings, Victorian in style, stood silent and forlorn, their windows like vacant eyes staring back at them. There was no sign of life, only the echoes of a past long gone. Driven by a mix of curiosity and apprehension, they decided to explore the town. The streets were deserted, covered in a layer of dust and leaves, as if untouched for decades. The eerie quiet was oppressive, the only sound their footsteps echoing off the decaying structures. In the town square, they found an old journal, its pages yellowed with age, lying on a bench. The handwriting was elegant but frantic, chronicling the town's descent into madness after a mining expedition unearthed something ancient and malevolent deep beneath the earth. As night approached, the group set up camp in the town, the car parked in the shadow of the derelict buildings. The whispers they had heard in the forest followed them, now interspersed with distant cries and the clanging of mining equipment. Their sleep was fitful, haunted by dreams of shadowy figures working tirelessly in the depths, their faces twisted in anguish. They woke to the sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, circling their camp. Peering out of their tents, they saw ghostly miners, their eyes hollow, endlessly repeating their doomed labor. The real terror began as darkness enveloped the town. Phantasmal lights flickered in the upper windows of the buildings, casting long, twisted shadows across the streets. Screams echoed in the distance, chilling them to the bone. In a panic, they decided to leave, but the town had other plans. The roads they had driven on were gone, replaced by dense forest. Their car, their lifeline to the outside world, refused to start, its engine silent despite their desperate attempts. Trapped and terrified, they realized they were not alone. The spirits of the town, bound to their eternal toil, began to emerge from the shadows. The air crackled with an unseen energy, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. Marcus vanished first, pulled into the shadows by unseen hands. The others searched frantically, calling out his name, but he was gone, swallowed by the night. They huddled together, realizing they were being hunted, the town reliving its final cursed days through them. Their only hope lay in uncovering the truth of what was buried beneath the town, to break the cycle that held both the living and the dead in its grasp. With no choice but to delve deeper into the heart of darkness, they set out to find the mine, their fear a constant companion. As they navigated the ghostly streets, they encountered obstacles that defied explanation. Shifting buildings, streets that led nowhere, and the relentless pursuit of the spectral miners. The whispers grew louder, now clear words spoken in a language they couldn't understand, yet the intent was unmistakable, a warning, a plea, a curse. The night in the lost town was a labyrinth of terror, each turn revealing a new horror, each step taking them closer to an unknown fate. But they pressed on, driven by the need to find Marcus and escape the grip of the shadows that had claimed the town, and now sought to claim them. The group's situation in the forsaken town grew increasingly dire. The night stretched on interminably, with every attempt to find the town's outskirts leading them in circles back to the center. The buildings seemed to rearrange themselves, creating a disorienting maze. The town was alive in the most malevolent sense, its very essence bent on ensnaring them. As they wandered the shifting streets, the whispers and cries of the spectral miners grew more intense. These apparitions were no longer just replaying their tragic end. They seemed to be aware of the group, their hollow eyes following their every move. Kyle, trying to maintain a brave front, suggested they search for the mine's entrance, hoping it might hold the key to breaking the curse. Mia, though terrified, agreed, her rational mind clinging to the hope that understanding the curse could give them power over it. Their search led them to the edge of town where the forest began. Here, they found an overgrown trail that descended into a dark, foreboding ravine. The air grew colder as they made their way down, the oppressive weight of the earth above bearing down on them. They found the mine entrance half collapsed, its dark maw like the mouth of some great beast. Taking a deep breath, they ventured inside, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the damp walls. The deeper they went, the more the mine felt like a living entity. The walls seemed to breathe, and the echoes of their footsteps were swallowed by the stifling air. They came across old mining equipment, left as if the workers had simply vanished into thin air. In the mine's depths, they discovered a cavern. Its walls were covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulsate with a sinister light. In the center of the cavern was an altar, atop which lay a variety of strange artifacts: a book bound in tattered skin, a collection of crude, handmade dolls, and a set of mining tools arranged in a ritualistic pattern. Mia, examining the book, found it was a journal, its pages filled with the ramblings of someone driven to madness. It spoke of unearthing an ancient entity deep within the mine, a being that promised power but brought only ruin. As they pieced together the story, the spectral miners converged on the cavern. Their whispers became a chorus of anger and sorrow, their forms more solid, more menacing. Suddenly, the group heard a familiar voice. It was Marcus. They found him in a side chamber, his eyes vacant, chanting words from the journal as if in a trance. Around him, shadows writhed and twisted, forming into shapes that were both terrifying and mesmerizing. Realizing Marcus was performing a ritual that was feeding the entity, they tried to snap him out of it. But as they approached, the shadows lashed out, forcing them back. The entity, now partially freed, began to manifest more fully. It was a creature of darkness, its form constantly shifting, its presence an abyss that threatened to consume not just the town, but their very souls. In a desperate bid to save their friend and themselves, the group formulated a plan. They would use the artifacts on the altar to perform a counter-ritual, hoping to banish the entity back to whatever hell it had come from. As they began the ritual, the entity fought back with terrifying ferocity. The cavern shook, rocks falling from the ceiling, threatening to bury them alive. The spectral miners, caught between their torment and the promise of release, became violent, attacking the group. Amidst the chaos, Kyle and Mia worked to complete the ritual, their voices joining in an ancient chant that seemed to weaken the entity. The shadows recoiled, the air filling with the sound of 1,000 screams. As they reached the climax of the ritual, a blinding light filled the cavern, emanating from the altar. The entity let out a final, ear-splitting roar before being sucked into a vortex of light and shadow. Exhausted and battered, the group made their way out of the mine, the path now clear. The town, too, seemed to have been released from its curse, the buildings crumbling into dust as the sun rose on the horizon. They found their car where they had left it, the road to Shadow Pass now just a normal stretch of highway. As they drove away, leaving the shadows behind, they knew their lives would never be the same. They had faced the darkest depths of fear and had emerged victorious, but the scars of their ordeal would remain with them forever. The early light of dawn filtered through the trees as the group, weary and shaken, emerged from the depths of the mine. The night's horrors still clung to them like a cold shroud, but there was a sense of finality, a hope that their ordeal might be over. As they made their way back through the now quiet town, they noticed the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. The buildings, once menacing, now seemed merely sad relics of a forgotten past. The spectral miners, their vengeful task complete, had vanished with the breaking of the dawn. The group found their car untouched, the road leading out of the town clear. With a collective sigh of relief, they piled in, eager to leave Shadow Pass behind. As they drove, the town disappeared into the mist, as if being erased from existence. The silence in the car was heavy, each lost in their reflections on the night's events. They had come seeking adventure but found themselves pitted against an ancient evil, their lives hanging in the balance. Kyle, who had always thrived on the thrill of the unknown, drove in silence, his usual bravado replaced by a somber contemplation. Mia, who had always been the voice of caution, seemed stronger, her resolve having been tested and proven. Marcus, recovered from his trance but still visibly shaken, sat quietly, his experience in the mine a private nightmare he was yet to fully process. The others, too, bore the weight of their experience, knowing they had barely escaped with their lives. As the sun rose higher, casting its light on the road ahead, they began to talk. At first, it was just a debrief of what had happened, an attempt to make sense of the chaos. But as they spoke, their conversation turned to the resilience of the human spirit, the strength they found in each other, and the unbreakable bond that had formed between them. They stopped at a small diner on the outskirts of Shadow Pass, the first sign of normalcy since their ordeal began. Over coffee and breakfast, They recounted their story to a disbelieving waitress, who laughed it off as an imaginative tale from weary travelers. As they continued their journey, the road stretched out before them, no longer a path to terror, but a highway to the future. They knew their story was one that would be hard to believe, a tale that would fade into legend like so many before it. But for them, the experience was all too real. They had stared into the abyss, faced their deepest fears, and emerged changed. The memories of Shadow Pass would linger, a haunting reminder of the night they descended into darkness and fought their way back to the light. As they neared the end of their road trip, the group made a silent pact to return to their normal lives, to move forward, but never to forget. They had survived the haunted highway of Shadow Pass, a testament to their courage and a story that would bind them for the rest of their lives. The road behind them faded into the distance, a chapter closed, but the lessons learned and the bonds formed would remain, a guiding light in the face of any darkness that might lie ahead. A gentle orange hue cast long shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon, heralding the start of another chilly evening in the small town of Fallsville. In the cozy corner of Molly's Diner, 4 lifelong friends gathered around a booth, the glow of the overhead lights reflecting off their hopeful young faces. They were on the brink of a new chapter in their lives, graduation. "I can't believe high school's almost over," Rachel mused, tracing the condensation on her soda glass with a slender finger. Her auburn hair cascaded down her shoulders, and her eyes held a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "It's surreal," agreed Alex, pushing up his glasses, his dark eyes reflecting deep thought. "Feels like just yesterday we were freshmen, navigating the hallways, getting lost, attending our first dance." Chris chuckled, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. "Remember when you spilled punch all over Principal Harris at the freshman dance, Alex?" Alex groaned, hiding his face in his hands. "Must you bring that up at every gathering?" Jamie, ever the peacemaker, stepped in. "Come on, Chris. Give Alex a break. Besides, it's our last night together before graduation. We should make it memorable." Chris's eyes lit up at Jamie's words. "Speaking of memorable," he began, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "How about one last adventure? A dare, if you will." Rachel rolled her eyes, a smirk forming on her lips. "Oh, here we go again. What's it this time, Chris?" "You know the old Lenox Hospital at the outskirts of town?" Chris questioned, excitement evident in his voice. Alex's eyebrows shot up. "The one that's been abandoned for decades? The one everyone says is haunted?" "That's the one," Chris confirmed with a nod. Jamie looked skeptical. "Chris, why on earth would we go there, especially at night?" Chris leaned back, an arrogant smile playing on his lips. "For the thrill, of course. Look, we're about to embark on new journeys in our lives. Don't you want one last adrenaline rush to remember our time together?" Rachel hesitated. "It does sound tempting, but are you sure it's safe?" Chris waved off her concerns. "Absolutely. I've been there before during the day. It's creepy but mostly harmless. We go in, explore a bit, and get out. A simple, unforgettable adventure." Jamie looked at Alex, searching for an answer. Alex sighed, adjusting his glasses. "All right, I'm in, but if I see even one ghost, I'm out of there." Rachel giggled, nudging Alex playfully. "All right, Braveheart, I'm in too." Jamie hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Okay, but we stick together. No wandering off on our own." Chris clapped his hands, his grin widening. "Perfect. Let's meet at the hospital's entrance at midnight. Bring flashlights and wear something warm. It's going to be a night to remember." And as the group left the diner, excited chatter filling the air, none of them could predict just how unforgettable the night would truly be. Midnight was punctuated by the eerie hoot of a lone owl perched atop a tree nearby. The moon was obscured by thick clouds, casting the world into near-total darkness. The Lenox Hospital loomed ominously, a vast silhouette against the star-studded sky. The once pristine white paint had faded and chipped, and ivy crept up its walls, reclaiming the structure for nature. Every window pane was shattered, hinting at past vandalism. The wind whistled through these gaps, producing a moaning sound that added to the desolate atmosphere. Rachel's breath misted in front of her, and she rubbed her arms for warmth. "We're really doing this, huh?" she whispered, staring up at the intimidating structure. Jamie, trying to hide her own trepidation, gave a weak smile. "One last adventure, right?" Alex took a deep breath, adjusting his glasses, which had fogged up from the cold. "Okay, team. Flashlights on. No splitting up. We go together. Always." Chris grinned, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Follow me," he declared, taking the lead. The group entered through the creaky main doors, their flashlights revealing a grand entrance hall, now covered in dust and graffiti. Cobwebs hung from the chandeliers, and the reception desk was overturned, paperwork scattered all over the ground. They moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing eerily in the vast emptiness. The air was damp, and a musky scent pervaded. As they went deeper, the remnants of the hospital's past became evident. Rusted gurneys, discarded syringes, shattered test tubes, and tattered patient records littered the ground. Suddenly, a distant metallic clang echoed through the hallways. The group froze. "What was that?" Rachel whispered, her voice shaky. Alex shone his flashlight in the direction of the noise. "Could be anything. A rodent. The wind. This place is falling apart." They continued their exploration, moving to the east wing of the hospital, where the children's ward used to be. As they entered, they were met with drawings on the walls, stick figures of families, trees, and the sun. Amidst the childish art, however, were other more unsettling scribbles. Dark, shadowy figures loomed over some of the beds in the drawings, and words like "he's here" or "don't look" were hastily written. Jamie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Guys, maybe we should head back." Chris, usually the bravest of the group, seemed uneasy as well. "Just a few more minutes. I want to see the old surgery room." The further they ventured, the more the hospital seemed to come alive. Muffled whispers could be heard, though their sources remained unseen. Cold spots appeared randomly, making the group shiver uncontrollably. The atmosphere grew thick with tension. As they approached the surgery room, the door creaked open slightly as if inviting them in. With bated breath, the group stepped inside. The room was surprisingly intact. An operating table sat in the center, rusted surgical tools scattered around. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. The flashlight beams began to flicker, and a low growl resonated throughout the room. "Chris," Rachel cried out, grabbing his arm. "This isn't fun anymore. We need to leave now." Chris, his face pale, nodded. Okay, let's get out." As they turned to leave, a shadow darted across the wall, though no source could be discerned. The whispers grew louder, morphing into anguished cries. Panic surged through the group. "Run!" Alex shouted. And with that command, they raced back the way they had come, desperate to escape the malevolent presence they had unwittingly awakened. The group ran frantically through the twisting corridors of the abandoned hospital. The dim beams of their flashlights swung wildly as they searched for the exit. Each turn they took was guided by pure instinct rather than memory, the oppressive darkness and their mounting fear distorting their sense of direction. The distant echoing cries grew nearer, accompanied now by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. It was as if the hospital itself was alive, its very walls breathing and watching their every move. Rachel, her lungs burning from the effort, stumbled over a discarded IV stand. Chris, immediately behind her, caught her arm, pulling her up. "Keep moving," he urged. Up ahead, Jamie cried out in terror. She had turned a corner only to be confronted by a tall, shadowy figure, its features obscured but its intent terrifyingly clear. The group skidded to a halt, their way blocked. "We need to hide," Alex whispered, his voice trembling with fear. He shone his flashlight into an adjacent room, revealing rows of empty, decaying hospital beds. "In here." The group slipped into the room, ducking down behind the beds. They turned off their flashlights, plunging the room into darkness, relying only on the faint moonlight filtering through the broken windows. Minutes felt like hours as they strained their ears, listening for any sign of their pursuer. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the corridor outside the room. The shadowy figure paused at the doorway, seeming to scan the room before moving on. Breathing a collective sigh of relief, the group emerged from their hiding place. "We need to stick together and find another way out," Alex whispered. "We can't risk running into that thing again." Making their way through the maze-like hospital, they tried to retrace their steps. They passed through the children's ward once more, the haunting drawings on the walls serving as eerie reminders of their earlier encounter. As they cautiously navigated the corridors, a faint light appeared in the distance. Drawn to it like moths to a flame, the group quickened their pace. The light emanated from a room at the end of a corridor, its door slightly ajar. Inside, they found a solitary lit candle on a table, surrounded by old photographs. They showed patients, doctors, and nurses, all with the same date, June 5, 1958. Among the photos was a newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearances at Lenox Hospital." The realization dawned on them. The cries, the footsteps, the shadowy figure, all were echoes of the past, souls trapped in an endless cycle of fear and despair. Suddenly, the room's temperature dropped. The door slammed shut, and the candle went out. The group was once again plunged into darkness. This time, however, they weren't alone. Blind panic took over. The oppressive darkness of the room was stifling, each member of the group desperately feeling around for an exit. The frigid air felt heavy, suffocating. Alex's hand brushed against the cold metal of the doorknob. He tried to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. The flicker of a lighter illuminated the room for a split second before being extinguished. In that fleeting moment of light, they saw her, a young woman, dressed in a nurse's uniform from the 1950s. Her eyes, devoid of any emotion, bore into theirs. Around her, the spectral images of patients, doctors, and nurses played out scenes of horror from a time long past. Chris, his voice breaking with fear, murmured, "June 5th, 1958. The nurse's gaze fixed on him. She took a step forward, her hand outstretched. "Help me," she whispered, her voice a chilling blend of desperation and sorrow. Rachel, her mind racing, remembered the newspaper clipping. The mysterious disappearances. "It was you, wasn't it? You're trying to tell us something." The nurse nodded, tears streaming down her face. The spectral images around her began to coalesce, forming a single, powerful memory. The group saw the hospital staff and patients, happy and laughing. But then, something changed. A darkness descended on the hospital. Patients began to disappear, one by one, their empty beds bearing silent testimony to the horror that had befallen them. Through the nurses' memories, the group witnessed the arrival of a new doctor. Charming and charismatic, he had quickly gained the trust of both staff and patients. But beneath his facade lay a sinister secret. Obsessed with the idea of achieving immortality, he had been conducting twisted experiments on the patients. Those who had disappeared had been subjected to his cruel tests, their souls trapped forever in the hospital. The nurse had discovered his secret and had tried to stop him, but she too had fallen victim to his madness. "We need to set them free," Jamie whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We need to put an end to this." Using the memories shown to them by the nurse, the group managed to find the doctor's office. Inside, amidst piles of yellowed papers and dusty medical equipment, they found an old journal. It detailed the doctor's experiments and his quest for immortality. On the last page, they found a ritual, designed to trap souls forever. Realizing that the ritual was the key to setting the trapped souls free, the group began to recite the incantations written in the journal. As they did, the hospital began to shake, the very walls seeming to scream in agony. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The oppressive darkness lifted, replaced by the soft glow of dawn. The spectral images of the patients, doctors, and nurses began to fade, their souls finally at peace. Exhausted and traumatized, the group made their way out of the hospital. As they stepped into the light, they knew they had witnessed something few would ever believe. But for them, the memories of that night would remain, a haunting reminder of the horrors that can lurk in the shadows. summer sun hung high in the clear blue sky as Jake, Emily, Marcus, and Sarah set out on their road trip. Fueled by the promise of adventure and the thrill of the unknown, they packed their car with snacks, a camera, and a map of the historic Route 55. The road was legendary, not just for its breathtaking views, but also for the spine-chilling tales that had been passed down through generations. Their journey began with laughter and playful banter, the car stereo blaring classic road trip tunes. They stopped at picturesque lookouts, took photos, and shared stories. As the day transitioned into evening, they found themselves driving through a stretch of road lined with dense forests. This was when they stumbled upon Reville. The town of Reville appeared suddenly, like a scene from an old movie. The buildings were worn, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. There wasn't a soul in sight. It felt as if the town had been frozen in time, a stark contrast to the lively energy of their journey so far. Curiosity piqued. The friends decided to take a detour through Reville. As they drove down the main street, an unsettling silence enveloped them. The town felt eerily abandoned, yet they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Their unease grew when they spotted a figure standing by the road, a man who looked out of place, his clothes ragged and his eyes piercing. Jake, always the brave one, pulled over, and they offered the man a ride. He accepted with a nod, his voice barely above a whisper as he got into the car. The hitchhiker's presence was unnerving. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were cryptic. He talked of a curse that plagued Route 55, a warning that went unheeded by most. The friends exchanged skeptical glances but humored him, attributing his tales to local superstitions. As they approached the end of the town, the man suddenly asked to be let out. Before leaving, he turned to them and said, "Beware the highway at night. It reveals truths best left hidden." Then he vanished into the thin air, leaving the group in stunned silence. Shaken, they continued their journey, but the mood in the car had shifted. The sky darkened and a dense fog began to roll in, obscuring the road ahead. That's when the whispers started. At first they thought it was the wind or the car, but as the whispers grew louder, it became clear they were coming from inside the car, from the back seat where the hitchhiker had sat. They were indecipherable, a language they couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning. They decided to set up camp by the roadside for the night, hoping to shake off the unease that had settled over them. But as they tried to sleep, the whispers continued, accompanied now by soft, rhythmic knocking, as if someone, or something, was tapping from inside the car. At exactly 3:33 a.m., the knocking intensified, jolting them awake. Outside, in the dim light of their flashlights, they saw shadows moving just beyond the trees, and the air was filled with the sounds of footsteps pacing around their campsite. Fear gripped them as they realized they were not alone. The road trip had taken a sinister turn, and they were now part of a story that was far from the adventure they had sought. The night was long, filled with strange sounds and the feeling of being watched, and as dawn broke, they knew one thing for certain. They had to uncover the truth behind Route 55 and the mysterious town of Reville. The morning light did little to dispel the sense of dread that had settled over the group. After a night of restless sleep, filled with unexplained noises and unsettling dreams, they were eager to leave the roadside camp. The events of the previous evening, the whispers, the knocking, and the eerie feeling of being watched had shaken them to the core. As they packed up, the fog that had enveloped the road seemed to thicken, creating an almost tangible barrier between them and the world outside their immediate surroundings. The once familiar Route 55 had taken on a sinister aspect, its scenery now more akin to the backdrop of a nightmare than the picturesque highway they had set out to explore. With Jake at the wheel, they resumed their journey, the car's headlights struggling to pierce the dense fog. The atmosphere in the car was tense, each of them lost in their own thoughts, the previous night's events weighing heavily on their minds. As they drove, it became apparent that something was very wrong. The road seemed unending, the scenery repetitive, as if they were driving in circles. The GPS was no help. It flickered and died, leaving them without any sense of direction. The radio, too, had ceased to function, replaced by a static hum that seemed to carry whispers within its white noise. It was Marcus who first noticed the oddities, landmarks they passed multiple times, despite driving straight ahead, and a growing sense of déjà vu with each mile. The realization dawned on them that they were trapped, caught in a loop on a stretch of highway that refused to lead them to their destination. Panic began to set in as they tried to find a way out of the looping road. They made turns at random, hoping to break free from the cycle, but it was futile. The road had them in its grip, and it wasn't letting go. As the day turned to evening, a sense of hopelessness began to overshadow their efforts. That's when they encountered the phantom car, an old, rusted vehicle that appeared out of the fog and sped towards them, its driver a shadowy figure with glowing eyes. Jake swerved just in time to avoid a collision, the car skidding dangerously before he regained control. Shaken by the near miss, they continued, only for the phantom car to reappear again and again, each encounter more aggressive than the last. It was as if the vehicle was hurting them, driving them towards an unknown destination. In a desperate bid for answers, they stopped at a diner that appeared seemingly out of nowhere. The diner, like the town of Reville, was stuck in time, its patrons ghostly figures locked in an endless loop of eating, drinking, and conversing. The group cautiously interacted with these spectral diners, but it was like speaking to shadows. They received no acknowledgement, no response. Exploring the diner, Emily stumbled upon a newspaper from 1955, the headline screaming about a tragic accident on Route 55 where a family had perished. The date of the accident was the same as the day they had begun their road trip. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the connection. They were reliving the day of the tragedy, trapped on the same stretch of road where the accident had occurred. Armed with this knowledge, they left the diner, determined to break free from the highway's grasp. But as they got back into the car, they found their surroundings had changed once again. The road before them was no longer the familiar Route 55. It had transformed into a narrow, winding path that led deeper into the fog. With no other options, they followed the path, the car's headlights revealing glimpses of shadowy figures that watched from the trees. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to be warning them, guiding them, driving them towards an inevitable confrontation with the unknown horrors of Route 55. The path seemed endless, winding through a landscape that was at once familiar and utterly alien. The dense fog obscured not only their vision, but also their sense of time. It felt as though they were driving through the night itself, a night that refused to yield to dawn. As the eerie path unwound, the car's headlights caught glimpses of figures watching from the darkness. These apparitions seemed more tangible than the phantoms they had seen before, their eyes glowing with a malevolent intent. The group felt the weight of their gazes, a pressure that seemed intent on driving them to madness. Exhaustion and fear were taking their toll on the friends. Arguments broke out, fueled by the stress of their predicament. It was during one such heated exchange that they almost missed the old motel, its sign partially obscured by overhanging branches. Desperate for rest, they decided to stop for the night. The motel was a relic of a bygone era, its interior decorated in a style that had not been in fashion for decades. The reception area was deserted, the silence oppressive. They called out, but there was no response, no sign of life. The guest register lay open on the counter, its pages filled with names and dates stretching back years. On impulse, Jake flipped through the pages, a growing sense of unease building within him as he realized that the last entry was dated the same day as their trip began. They chose rooms at random, the keys hanging unclaimed on an old wooden board. Each room was a time capsule, preserved and untouched, dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that filtered through grimy windows. Sarah discovered a newspaper clipping in her room, yellowed with age, detailing the tragic accident on Route 55. It spoke of a family that had vanished, leaving behind only a wrecked car and a mystery that had never been solved. The article hinted at rumors of a curse, a darkness that had descended upon the highway. The group gathered in one of the rooms, their fear now mixed with a desperate need for answers. They pored over the newspaper clipping and the diary they had found earlier. It became clear that the highway was reliving its tragedy, trapping them in a loop of sorrow and death. As they discussed their options, a chilling realization dawned on them. Their missing friend might be a replay of the past, a victim claimed by the highway's curse. They needed to act, to find a way to break the cycle before they too became permanent residents of this ghostly road. Determined to uncover the truth and save themselves, they ventured back outside. The fog had thickened, cloaking the motel and the surrounding area in an impenetrable shroud. Whispered voices called out to them from the mist, echoes of the past that beckoned them deeper into the mystery. Armed with flashlights, they followed the whispers to a nearby grove, where the remains of a car lay hidden among the trees. It was old, ravaged by time and the elements, a silent testament to the tragedy that had occurred. As they approached, the air grew colder, and the whispers became screams, the screams of a family torn apart by an unseen force. The atmosphere was charged with sorrow, the pain of the lost souls palpable in the air. Amidst the wreckage, they found a locket, its chain rusted but still intact. Inside was a photograph of a family. The same family from the newspaper clipping, their faces smiling, unaware of the fate that awaited them. It was then that the apparitions appeared, not just shadows but full-bodied specters, their expressions tormented. The family from the accident, bound to the site of their demise, their spirits unable to move on. The group realized they were witnessing the final moments of these lost souls, trapped in an endless replay of their last night on Earth. The spirits seemed to recognize them, their eyes filled with a plea for release. Tom, acting on a hunch, placed the locket in the center of the wreckage. The air shimmered, and for a moment the fog lifted, revealing a clear night sky. The spirits gathered around the locket, their forms becoming more defined, more human. In that instant, the group understood their role. They were not just accidental travelers on this haunted highway. They were the key to breaking the curse, to freeing these trapped souls. With renewed determination, they joined hands around the wreckage, focusing their thoughts on release and freedom. The air crackled with energy, a light growing within the circle they had formed. The spirits began to fade, their expressions changing from despair to peace. The air around the wrecked car was alive with a pulsating energy, a tangible force of release and closure. As the Hargreaves, their hands still joined in a circle, channeled their collective will towards freeing the trapped spirits, they felt an overwhelming surge of emotions, sorrow, regret, and finally, liberation. The spirits of the family, their forms becoming clearer in the ethereal light, began to express gratitude. Their mouths didn't move, but their eyes conveyed a message of thanks. They no longer appeared tormented. Instead, there was a sense of peace about them. The mother spirit, a gentle figure who had borne the brunt of the tragedy, reached out towards the locket. As her ethereal hand touched it, the locket glowed brightly, a beacon in the enveloping darkness. The glow intensified, enveloping the spirits in the wreckage. The Hargreaves shielded their eyes against the brilliance. When the light finally dimmed, the spirits were gone, and the air felt different, lighter, free of the oppressive weight that had hung over the highway. As they looked around, they realized the fog was lifting, revealing the familiar surroundings of Route 55. The endless loop they had been trapped in was broken. The sun was rising on the horizon, casting its first light on a new day. The road ahead was clear, the shadows and apparitions gone. The group returned to their car in silence, each processing the night's surreal events in their own way. As they drove away, the once menacing road now seemed just like any other highway. They passed the spot where they had first encountered the phantom car, but it was just an empty stretch of road now. Their journey continued without incident, the landscape bathed in the warm glow of the morning sun. They spoke little, but a bond had formed between them, forged in the shared crucible of their supernatural ordeal. As they neared the end of Route 55, they saw the diner where they had first learned of the highway's tragic past. It looked different in daylight, just a quaint roadside eatery. They stopped for breakfast, a meal that tasted of relief and survival. The patrons were just regular people, not the ghostly figures from their nocturnal visit. The group shared a look, an unspoken agreement to keep the night's events to themselves. Who would believe such a tale? It was their secret, a shared experience that would forever color their perception of the world. As they left the diner, they glanced back at Route 55. It was just a road now, but they knew its secrets. They had faced the unknown, confronted their fears, and come out stronger. The road trip had started as an adventure and ended as a journey into the heart of the supernatural. The experience had changed them, They were no longer just college friends on a summer break. They were survivors of the haunted highway. As they drove off, leaving Route 55 behind, they knew they were leaving a part of themselves on that road, a testament to their courage and the spirits they had set free. In Marrowdale, where the past seemed to seep through the cobblestones and into the souls of its residents, the ancient Witherfork estate stood as a monument to bygone grandeur. It was as if time had etched itself into the woodwork, woven its narrative into the tapestries that adorned its walls. And as the leaves began to don their autumnal hues, the estate's doors creaked open for the dispersal of its contents, a veritable treasure trove amassed over a century by the late and enigmatic Mrs. Henrietta Witherfork. Eli, with his quiet demeanor and an ever-present aura of contemplation, was not one to indulge in local folklore. As a history teacher, he sought the truth obscured within the myths, the facts interred beneath the legends. Yet as he stepped through the iron-wrought gates of the Witherfork property, he could not suppress the flicker of intrigue for the stories that swirled around the matriarch of this dominion. It was whispered that Mrs. Witherfork dabbled in the occult, that her wealth was not merely monetary but steeped in arcane knowledge. The estate sale was a bustling tableau of curiosity seekers and bargain hunters, yet Eli's eyes were drawn to an item that seemed untouched by the eager hands of the crowd, an ornate mirror, its mahogany frame carved with intricate motifs that suggested a narrative all its own. It was a stately piece, but it was the glass itself that held Eli's gaze. It seemed deeper than a mere reflective surface, as though it held a sliver of the void within its silvered expanse. Acting on a compulsion that felt like the pull of destiny, Eli approached the auctioneer and placed his bid. The gavel fell, and a murmur went through the crowd, as if they collectively exhaled a breath they hadn't been aware they were holding. As if, subconsciously, they were relieved to be rid of the mirror's silent gaze. Eli had the mirror installed in his study by dusk. There, amongst his books and artifacts, it seemed to be a sentinel of history, a silent guardian of the past. Yet, as the evening wore on, and shadows danced in the candlelight, Eli observed a curious phenomenon. His reflection within the mirror's surface was delayed, trailing his movements by a fraction of a moment. It was a subtle discrepancy, but to Eli's discerning eye, it was as blatant as a scream in the silence. Rational explanations crowded his thoughts, a trick of the light, an optical illusion, fatigue perhaps. But as the days passed, the delay in his reflection became a disconcerting constant. His image seemed to live in a time slightly askew from his own. A sip of tea not yet taken, a book not yet picked up, a shiver not yet felt. Eli began to see actions in the mirror before he performed them. Determined to demystify the mirror's secret, Eli scoured the town's archives, delving into the history of the Witherfork estate. He uncovered tales of an artisan mirror maker from a bygone era, a figure shrouded in mystery and whispers of forbidden knowledge. This mirror maker, it was said, sought to capture time itself, to encase it within the confines of his creations. Each mirror was rumored to be a temporal experiment, and the piece now residing in Eli's study was allegedly his magnum opus. This craftsman's tale ended as abruptly as it began, with his works scattered to the winds, their secrets entombed within their reflective depths. Eli traced the mirror's lineage through accounts of its previous owners, each tale more fantastic and unsettling than the last. One spoke of a woman who claimed she could glimpse her departed husband within its depths, another of a man who swore he saw his own death play out across its surface. The trail led inexorably back to Mrs. Witherfork, who was said to converse with reflections that were not her own. It was not merely a delay in his reflection that plagued Eli now. Within the glass, shadows began to move with autonomy. Figures took form, and faces peered out from the other side. They were spectators to his existence, their eyes filled with the wisdom of the ages and a hunger for the life that beat within his veins. The mirror began to show not just slight alterations in time, but snatches of events yet to come, dark, twisted visions of potential futures that clawed at the edges of reality. Eli watched in horror as his reflection began to diverge from his actions entirely, taking on a life of its own. It was during a particularly chilling event, as Eli observed his reflected self writing a letter he had not yet penned, that a knock echoed through the house. It was a sound that seemed to resonate from within the mirror itself, a harbinger of a reality fraying at the edges. As he turned to answer the door, Eli's reflected self remained, and within the glass it began to grin. A grin that did not belong to Eli, a grin that bespoke a malicious anticipation. Eli stood at the precipice of an abyss. The mirror was no longer a mere object in his home. It had become a portal, a convergence of timelines that beckoned him towards an uncertain fate. And as the study's air grew colder, and the fabric of the familiar began to unravel, Eli understood that he was no longer the observer of history. He was becoming a part of its darkest chapter. As the nights grew longer and the wind whispered tales of the approaching winter through the eaves of his home, Eli's relationship with the mirror changed from curiosity to an unspoken dread. It was not just the delay anymore, nor the premonitions. His reflection started to show him scenes he didn't recognize, scenes steeped in darkness, with flickers of actions that chilled him to the bone. His scholarly detachment was replaced by a visceral fear of what the mirror might reveal next. One evening, as the dying light cast long shadows across his study, Eli saw something in the mirror that cemented his growing terror. The reflection showed him in the study just as he was, but there was someone, or something, else with him. A shadowy figure with its back turned stood in the corner of the room. When Eli whirled around, the corner was empty, but in the mirror, the figure remained. It then turned its head, revealing a face that was a grotesque mockery of human features, as if mocking his fear. Eli began to dive deeper into the mirror's past, unearthing disturbing incidents that were too consistent to be coincidental. Each owner had experienced strange happenings, often culminating in tragedy. One owner vanished without a trace. Another was found insane, whispering incessantly about the eyes in the glass. Eli's research led him to discover that the mirror was known among the occult circles as the Witherfork Window, a moniker that filled him with a profound unease. Driven by a need to understand, Eli reached out to an acquaintance from his university days, Vanessa, who was now a renowned expert in the esoteric. He spoke to her of the mirror's peculiarities, omitting the more unsettling experiences. Vanessa was intrigued and agreed to visit, her curiosity piqued by the historical and supernatural implications. Her arrival brought a new energy to the house, and for a brief moment, Eli's fears were abated by her pragmatic presence. They began a methodical study of the mirror, documenting its aberrations and attempting to discern a pattern or logic to the events Eli had witnessed. Vanessa was the one who proposed they attempt to communicate with the reflections, a suggestion that filled Eli with a profound trepidation. The attempt was to be made under strict conditions, with protections and countermeasures Vanessa assured were tried and true methods against malevolent entities. They set up their equipment, a mix of the ancient and the modern, and began their experiment as night fell. The mirror, as if aware of their intentions, was eerily quiescent at first. Then, as Vanessa chanted incantations from a text that Eli's rational mind would have scoffed at mere days ago, the surface of the mirror rippled like the surface of a dark pond. Images began to coalesce, scenes of past owners, each caught in moments of intense emotion, anger, sorrow, fear, emotions that seemed to feed the mirror. It was then that the figure from Eli's vision appeared in the glass, its ghastly face turning towards them. Vanessa continued her chant, unshaken, while Eli felt an icy grip of fear clutch at his heart. The room grew colder, the air charged with an electricity that made the hairs on Eli's neck stand on end. The figure in the mirror reached out, pressing its hand against the glass, and to Eli's horror, the hand began to push through to their side. In a panic, Eli broke the circle they had created around the mirror, grabbing Vanessa and pulling her away as the room seemed to warp around them. The mirror's surface shattered with a sound like thunder, shards of glass flying like dark rain. But it was the silence that followed which was most terrifying, a silence that was absolute, as if the mirror had swallowed every sound. When the world righted itself, Eli and Vanessa found that the study was exactly as it had been before, not a shard of glass out of place, the mirror whole and unblemished. But in the glass, the figure was gone. They were left with the chilling realization that whatever had been in the mirror was now in the room with them. In the stillness following the mirror's apparent absorption of sound and reality, Eli and Vanessa struggled to comprehend the extent of what had transpired. Their breathing was shallow, eyes locked onto the mirror, half expecting further malevolence to emerge. But it remained still, its glassy surface reflecting only the mundane safety of the room. Yet a primal part of their minds screamed that the danger was far from over. It had merely shifted, taken root in a more immediate plane. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with unspoken fears. Vanessa broke the silence, her voice steady, but her eyes betrayed her alarm. "We need to find it," she insisted, "before it finds us." The search was methodical. They combed every corner of the study, then the rest of the house. Vanessa had hastily drawn protective symbols at the thresholds of each room, wards she hoped would offer some respite from their unseen pursuer. Hours ticked by. The moon's glow waned, and yet they found nothing. No specter awaited in the shadows. No ethereal whispers disturbed the silence. Eli was the one to find the first sign. A mirror in the hallway, once pristine, was now fogged from corner to corner, except for a single clear patch in the center. As he peered into it, the chill of recognition seized him. In the clear patch, he saw not his own reflection, but the study, the mirror standing like a silent sentinel, and within its glass a shadow darted past. They realized then that it wasn't about finding the entity, it was about understanding what it sought, what it needed. It wasn't hiding, it was searching, and it was tied to the mirrors. Vanessa, through her extensive knowledge of the occult, theorized that they were dealing with a creature of reflection, a being that existed within and through mirrored surfaces. It was not in the room with them, but rather in all rooms, simultaneously, through the panes of glass that adorned Eli's home. They spent the following day reinforcing the house's defenses, covering mirrors and researching. Eli scoured through texts on folklore and demonology, seeking any mention of entities that traversed via reflections, while Vanessa contacted her network of occultists for any shred of information on similar occurrences. As night descended once more, they prepared for another encounter, but with greater caution. This time, they would not attempt to banish it without understanding the potential repercussions. Vanessa had brought a small handheld mirror, one that was deeply etched with sigils and runes, a containment device for entities that lacked physical form. The entity made its presence known subtly at first, a mere flicker of movement in a distant mirror, a brief clouding of glass. Then, with sudden violence, every covered mirror in the house shuddered simultaneously, a deafening cacophony of bangs that tested their nerve. With the small enchanted mirror at the ready, they approached the main study. The air inside was markedly colder, breaths turning to mist, and the Witherfork mirror's surface swirled with a miasma of shadows. The entity revealed itself fully then, a distortion in the air, a ripple in reality that coalesced into a vaguely human shape before the mirror. It was a maelstrom of darkness, edges flickering like the flame of a candle caught in the wind. Vanessa stepped forward, her voice clear as she began an incantation, the enchanted mirror held out before her like a shield. The entity seemed to recoil, its form becoming erratic, chaotic. But it was not retreating. It was preparing. With a sound like a crack of lightning, it surged forward, an assault of pure malevolence aimed at the heart of their defenses. Eli felt a force push him aside as Vanessa was thrown back, her incantation cut off by the entity's onslaught. The enchanted mirror skittered across the floor, its surface now cracked. The room was a whirlwind of supernatural force, books ripped from shelves, furniture sliding as if the house itself was rejecting the entity's presence. In a desperate bid, Eli lunged for the cracked mirror. The entity turned its attention towards him, a terrible pressure building in the air. Words from Vanessa's fallen tome came unbidden to his lips, and with a defiant shout, he spoke a command, his voice carrying the weight of ancient authority. The entity halted, its form shuddering, and then, with a noise like a sigh from the depths of the earth, it recoiled back into the main mirror. Eli scrambled to his feet, grabbing the sigil-etched mirror. He aligned it with the Witherfork mirror, and with a last utterance, a flash like a solar flare filled the room, and then there was darkness. When the light returned, Eli found the Witherfork mirror's surface was no longer reflective. It was dull, consumed by an impenetrable blackness. The entity, it seemed, was contained. The aftermath of the entity's containment was a silence so profound it felt like a presence in itself. Eli and Vanessa moved through the house in a daze, their minds grappling with the residue of adrenaline and terror. Each mirror they passed, now benign and ordinary, was a stark reminder of the night's harrowing events. Morning found them seated at Eli's kitchen table, surrounded by ancient tomes and the debris of their frantic research. The Witherfork mirror, its surface an abyss that no light could penetrate, stood against the wall, ominous even in its apparent dormancy. They spoke little of the ordeal, as if discussing it might somehow weaken the barriers they had erected. But questions plagued Eli's thoughts, whispers of doubt that refused to be stilled. Was the entity truly contained? What if their actions had consequences they had not foreseen? As if in answer to his unspoken fears, an occurrence in town began to weave a thread of unease into the fabric of their victory. Reports emerged of peculiar blackouts, instances where reflections should be but weren't, affecting the townsfolk. Mirrors in public bathrooms, shop windows, even puddles after a rain. People whispered of glimpses into an unrelenting darkness. Eli couldn't shake the chilling suspicion that these events were linked to the mirror. Vanessa, though weary, could not deny the parallels. They resolved to investigate, fearing what they might find. Their first stop was a local diner, where the most recent incident had caused a stir. The owner, a gruff man with skeptical eyes, showed them the mirror in question. It was small, tucked away in a corner of the ladies' room, but its surface was as impenetrable as that of the Witherfork mirror. "This here's bad for business," the owner muttered, but Eli barely heard him. He was focused on the mirror, the way his own reflection should have been there but wasn't. It was as if a piece of the entity remained, lurking, spreading its influence like a disease. The pattern was repeating, each occurrence a mirror image of the Witherfork mirror's symptoms. It was spreading, not contained at all but multiplying, fracturing across the town like a spiderweb of darkness. Vanessa's voice was grim as they left the diner. "We've opened a door," she said. "One we don't know how to close." They worked tirelessly, visiting affected sites, researching and reaching out to every knowledgeable contact they had. The answers were elusive, the lore of such phenomena scarce and speculative at best. Eli began to fear they were fighting a losing battle against an enemy that defied the laws of nature. As Halloween approached, the town grew restless. The celebrations, once a focal point of the community, were subdued, the usual revelry tinged with a collective unease. The darkness had seeped into more than just mirrors. It was in the air, an undercurrent of dread that touched every shadow and whispered caution with the rustling leaves. On the eve of Halloween, Eli made a decision. The Witherfork mirror could not remain in his home, a beacon for whatever malevolent force they had unleashed. With Vanessa's reluctant agreement, they prepared to remove it from the house to seek a means to destroy it. But the mirror had other plans. As they approached it, the darkness within stirred. It swelled, reaching out beyond the frame, a tangible mass of shadow that filled the room with an oppressive gloom. Eli and Vanessa stood transfixed, as though the darkness sought not only to invade the physical space, but their very minds, sowing seeds of despair and defeat. Vanessa acted first, her incantation slicing through the air, her willpower a lighthouse in the storm. Eli joined her, his voice adding to the chorus of resistance. Together, they fought to repel the encroaching darkness, to force it back into the mirror. The struggle was titanic, a battle of light against dark, of life against an abyss that hungered for existence. And as the clock ticked towards midnight, the veil between worlds at its thinnest, the outcome hung in the balance, as fragile as the flame of a candle in the wind. The brisk October air nipped at Ethan's cheeks as he strode through the tangled rows of Miller's farm, his breath visible in the pale moonlight. The old farm was a relic, nestled on the outskirts of their sleepy town, known for the legend of Old Man Miller, who vanished on Halloween night decades ago, leaving only a field of withered crops and a weathered barn in his wake. "Come on, slowpokes," Ethan called out to his friends, who were cautiously picking their way through the pumpkin patch, casting nervous glances at the gnarled trees that bordered the field. Halloween was Ethan's element, the one time of year when his love for the macabre and the spooky became a communal celebration. He had convinced his friends to start the night with a pumpkin carving contest. Best jack-o'-lantern wins bragging rights for a year. Lara, Ethan's childhood friend, who prided herself on not buying into scary stories, held a flashlight under her chin, casting long shadows across her face. "Ooh, I'm so scared," she mocked in a ghostly wail. "Old man Miller's going to get us." But as they ventured deeper, even Lara's bravado faltered. The pumpkins here were different, bigger, stranger, as if they'd been fed on the whispers of the farm's eerie past. That's when Ethan saw it, the pumpkin. It wasn't the largest nor the most symmetrical, but it had an aura of malice, its natural creases forming a twisted grin. "That's the one," he said, a sense of triumph in his voice as he pointed towards the misshapen gourd. "You sure, man?" Tyler, the group's skeptic, raised an eyebrow. "Looks like trouble." "It's perfect," Ethan insisted, his eyes not leaving the pumpkin, which seemed to stare back with a challenge. With some effort, he pried it from the vine's tight grip, and the air around them grew perceptibly colder. By the time they returned to Ethan's house, a sense of unease had settled over the group. They lined up their pumpkins on the porch, the other gourds round and cheerful in the glow of the porch light. Except Ethan's, which seemed to absorb the light, its grin more pronounced in the shadows. As they scooped out the insides and carved faces into their pumpkins, Ethan's knife slipped repeatedly, guided by an unseen force. His pumpkin's eyes took shape, hollow and deep, and the mouth seemed to stretch, the grin slicing wider across the bulbous surface, dripping a thick black sap onto the porch. "You're really going for the horror theme, huh?" Lara joked, trying to lighten the mood, but her laughter was tinged with unease. They placed candles inside their creations, stepping back to admire their handiwork. One by one, the pumpkins came to life with flickering candlelight, except Ethan's. It didn't need a candle. Its grin seemed to glow from within, casting shadows that danced and twisted on the porch like silent specters waiting to pounce. "Okay, that's pretty cool," Tyler admitted, though he kept his distance. "How'd you do that?" "I didn't," Ethan murmured, his voice almost a whisper. "It's doing it on its own." The jack-o'-lantern's grin seemed to mock them, the black sap reflecting the moonlight like a pool of oil. The laughter and chatter died down as a chill descended upon them, a whispering wind swirling around, carrying with it the scent of decay and the faintest echo of Old Man Miller's legacy. The night was just beginning, and already, Halloween was proving to be more than they'd bargained for. As the friends gathered their things, ready to head out into the night's festivities, Ethan cast one last glance at the grinning pumpkin. He could have sworn he saw a flicker of something in its hollow eyes, a hint of cunning, of malevolence. Shaking off the feeling, he closed the door behind him, unaware of the forces he had unwittingly unleashed. As the evening progressed, the carefree laughter of children dressed as ghouls and superheroes filled the air. Ethan's group of friends mingled with the crowd, their earlier encounter with the ominous pumpkin, temporarily forgotten amid the revelry of trick-or-treating and the raucous laughter of costumed party-goers. But as the night deepened, a change came over the town. A cold wind began to howl through the streets, carrying with it a strange whisper that seemed to rustle through the leaves and rattle the windows. The festive lights flickered, casting long, darting shadows against the houses. One by one, the trick-or-treaters retreated indoors, an unspoken unease spreading amongst them. Ethan, Lara, and Tyler found themselves walking down a narrow lane, the houses here older and the decorations more elaborate. Jack-o'-lanterns leered from every stoop, their candles guttering in the growing wind. But it was one particular pumpkin that caught Ethan's eye, a replica of the one he had left on his porch, its grin wide and malicious. "Guys, do you see that?" Ethan pointed toward the pumpkin, its grin seemingly wider than before. "It's just a pumpkin, Ethan," Lara said, though her voice was less certain. "Let's keep going." As they continued, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. He glanced back repeatedly, half expecting to see the pumpkin from his porch rolling after them, its grin slicing through the darkness. But it was only the shadows that seemed to chase them, growing longer and more distorted with each step. It wasn't long before they realized they were no longer on the familiar path. The houses here were decrepit, their windows like dark, empty eyes. The decorations were old and worn, not a single light to guide their way. They had wandered into the forgotten part of town, where stories of haunted dwellings and ghostly apparitions were passed down through generations. "This isn't right," Tyler muttered, his usual skepticism drowned out by the creeping dread. "We should have hit Main Street by now." Lara's flashlight flickered, then died, plunging them into darkness. They stood there, hearts pounding as the whispers grew louder, surrounding them with voices that seemed to speak a language as old as fear itself. And then they saw it, the glow of a singular jack-o'-lantern, perched atop an old iron gate that led to a house shrouded in ivy and despair. Its light was not warm or inviting, but cold and blue, casting an unearthly pallor over everything it touched. Without knowing why, they were drawn to it, their feet moving of their own accord. As they approached, the whispers crescendoed into a cacophony of silent screams that reverberated in their skulls. The pumpkin's grin seemed to beckon them, promising untold secrets and forbidden knowledge. They stood before the gate, unable to move forward, yet unable to tear their eyes away from the jack-o'-lantern's mesmerizing glow. It was then that the ground beneath them began to tremble, and a low, guttural laughter rose from the bowels of the earth, shaking the very air around them. "What did you do, Ethan?" Lara's voice was tinged with accusation, her eyes wide with horror. But before Ethan could reply, the gate swung open with a groan, inviting them into the darkness beyond. They were on the precipice of a nightmare, the jack-o'-lantern's grin their only guide into the abyss. The ancient gate, with its iron maw agape, seemed like a passage to another realm, a place where the veils between worlds grew thin and the dead whispered through the rustling leaves. The children, though bound by a tapestry of fear, felt an irresistible compulsion drawing them forward. Ethan, Lara, and Tyler crossed the threshold, their footsteps echoing ominously. The laughter that had beckoned them now fell silent, replaced by the palpable heartbeat of the night. They followed the dim light of the jack-o'-lantern, which hovered in the air like a will-o'-the-wisp, leading them to the house that seemed to sag with the weight of untold sorrows. The facade was a grotesque mask, windows cracked and gaping, the door ajar as if disgorging a long-held breath. Ivy crawled up the sides like constricting veins on weathered skin, and the jack-o'-lantern settled on the porch as if returning to its rightful throne. "I don't like this," Tyler whispered, a sentiment echoed in Lara's clenched fists and Ethan's quickening pulse. But the house called to them, its whispers more insistent than the wind that now caressed their necks with icy fingers. As they entered, a chill enveloped them, the darkness within far surpassing the night outside. The jack-o'-lantern's glow cast monstrous silhouettes that danced upon the decaying walls. With each step, the dust stirred, rising like specters to greet them. They explored the ground floor, a labyrinth of rooms and corridors that seemed to shift and sigh with a life of their own. Ancient portraits adorned the walls, eyes following them, expressions twisted in silent screams or mocking laughter. Furniture lay draped in white sheets like ghosts frozen mid-haunt. Then a sound, a child's giggle, distant and distorted, led them to the base of a grand staircase, its balusters like the ribcage of some titanic beast. The giggle beckoned them upward, and they ascended, drawn by the inexplicable desire to discover its source. At the top, they were met with a corridor lined with doors. The laughter echoed from behind each one, a chorus of childish mirth that was anything but innocent. Lara reached for a doorknob, and the laughter ceased abruptly as if the children behind the doors were holding their breath. She pushed it open, revealing only darkness. But as they peered inside, the darkness seemed to peer back, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. The jack-o'-lantern flared brightly, its grin stretching impossibly wide, and then the darkness surged forward, engulfing Lara in its embrace. She screamed, a sound that would haunt Ethan and Tyler forever, and when the darkness receded, she was gone, swallowed by the shadows that had claimed her. Ethan and Tyler, hearts hammering against their ribs, ran. They stumbled through the corridor, the house alive with the sound of Lara's screams and the childlike giggles that now sounded predatory. Down the staircase they hurtled, past the leering portraits and through the rooms that had become a maze of horror. The house seemed to stretch and distort, the exit an ever-receding promise. Behind them, the jack-o'-lantern followed, its grin a beacon of malevolence, and the very air around them vibrated with the sound of Lara's name, whispered with the sibilance of a snake. The house was no longer just a house. It was a living, breathing entity, and they were within its belly, being slowly digested by its ancient hunger. They could see the door ahead, the darkness pressing close when suddenly a figure stepped into their path. Not Lara, not a ghost, but something far older and more terrible, a silhouette outlined by the unholy light of the jack-o'-lantern. The figure spoke, its voice a symphony of screams and whispers. "You should not have come here. You should not have listened to the Grin." And as the words washed over them, reality blurred, and Ethan and Tyler found themselves not in the house, but in their own homes, safe in their beds, the night outside silent and dark. But the silence was a lie, and the darkness was full of eyes. The dawn that broke over the neighborhood was a charade, a veil of light over an abyss that had opened the night before. Ethan and Tyler awoke in their beds, but the comfort of daylight could not chase away the horrors that had claimed the darkness. They met under the somber sky, the sun masked by heavy clouds, the air as still as a crypt. The night's terrors were etched in their eyes, a haunted gaze that spoke of truths too ghastly to articulate. They had to go back. They had to find Lara. The house stood defiant against the day, its shadows deep and impenetrable, as if light dared not trespass. The door was agape, just as they remembered, the silence within beckoning. They entered, the jack-o'-lantern's grin now absent, its flame extinguished, but its presence lingered, a malignancy in the air, a stain upon the world. They called for Lara, their voices hollow in the oppressive silence. The house seemed to listen, the very walls leaning in with bated breath. Then the laughter started again, but this time it was not the carefree laughter of children. It was the sound of something that knew no joy, only hunger. The boys moved with purpose, their every step a defiance. They climbed the stairs, which groaned under the weight of their resolve. The corridor of doors awaited, each a sentinel to a realm of fear. They chose a door, different from before, and threw it open. Inside they found a room shrouded in cobwebs, the furniture draped in white, like specters in mourning. At the center, a figure stood with its back to them. Lara. But around her neck, the jack-o'-lantern hung like a grotesque amulet, its grin reignited, basking the room in a hellish glow. As they approached, Lara turned, her eyes hollow, her mouth moving with silent screams. The pumpkin's light pulsed, and the room seemed to breathe with it, the walls flexing, the shadows writhing. Lara reached out, her hand a claw of desperation. Ethan and Tyler rushed to her side, their hands clasping hers, their combined strength fighting against the pumpkin's unnatural pull. They pulled, and with a sound like a wound tearing open, Lara was freed, the jack-o'-lantern falling to the floor with a thud that shook the room. The house trembled, a low growl rising from its depths, the very foundation screaming in rage. They ran, half dragging Lara between them, her strength returning with each step towards escape. Behind them, the house convulsed, the rooms collapsing into each other, the darkness at their heels a living thing. The laughter turned into howls, a cacophony of madness that sought to consume them. They burst through the door, the daylight an explosion of reality, the house's final cry echoing into silence. They didn't stop, didn't look back, until they reached the safety of the crowd that had gathered, drawn by the spectacle of the house that now lay in ruins, its fury spent, its presence expunged. The jack-o'-lantern lay amidst the wreckage, its grin finally extinguished, the curse it had carried now nothing more than a bad dream fading in the morning light. They held each other in the aftermath, the truth of what had occurred a shared secret that bound them together. Lara was safe, but the innocence they had lost was a price paid in full to the shadows that still watched from the corners of their eyes. As the years passed, the story of the haunted house and the jack-o'-lantern that grinned with malevolence became a tale told in hushed tones, a warning to those who tread too close to the veil between worlds. And every Halloween, when the pumpkins were carved, Ethan, Lara, and Tyler would remember, and they would ensure that no pumpkin ever bore a grin quite like the one they had seen. For in that grin lay an abyss, and they had gazed into it, and it had gazed back. The Hargreaves family hadn't intended to move to Hillgrove, but the moment they laid eyes on the old Victorian home nestled in its heart, it felt like fate. The real estate agent had spun a tale of a quaint town with salt-of-the-earth folks where history lived in harmony with the slow, steady drum of small-town life. The home itself was a relic of a bygone era, with its gables, a wraparound porch, and the kind of attic you'd expect to be filled with treasures of the past. For the first few weeks, the Hargreaves busied themselves with the usual post-move activities, unpacking, decorating, and the parents, Michael and Sarah, setting boundaries for their 3 children in the new, expansive home. Tommy, the youngest at 7, had a spirit for exploration that matched the pioneers of old. His insatiable curiosity led him to every nook and cranny, every closet, and every dusty corner. It was during one of his expeditions that he came across the peculiar discovery in the basement, a false wall that concealed a door. The door was unlike any other in the house. It was sturdy, old, and had a coldness to it that seeped into the bones. No keyhole was visible, only a heavy padlock, rusted through the ages, sealed its secrets away. The parents were perplexed. They'd scoured the house's blueprints before purchasing, and there was no indication of any additional rooms. They asked around, but the townsfolk seemed to know nothing, or chose to say nothing about the door. "It's probably just an old storage room," Michael had suggested one night over dinner, trying to assuage the children's growing fears and his own. But storage rooms didn't need such locks. Storage rooms didn't make the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. And storage rooms certainly didn't make noise. Yet, every night, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the Hargreaves were roused by a soft thumping from the direction of the basement. Tommy claimed he heard it first, but soon, they all did. It began as a curiosity, then a nuisance, but as the days passed, the thumping grew into a more assertive knocking. It wasn't the house settling, nor was it any kind of piping issue. This sound had an intention behind it. When Michael placed his hand upon the cold surface of the cellar door one night, he felt the knocks reverberate through his very soul, as if something on the other side was reaching out, tapping into his deepest, most primal fears. As the pattern continued, the family found themselves ensnared in the grips of the house's secret. Sleep evaded them, replaced by discussions filled with theories ranging from the plausible to the absurd. Sarah, ever the practical one, suggested they may have rats or some other pest trapped within. But deep down, they all knew this was different. This was otherworldly. The knocking grew louder, more fervent, as if whatever lay beyond that door was growing impatient. The dread seeped into their daily lives, painting every shadow with suspicion, every silence with anticipation for the next night's knocking. They knew they couldn't ignore it forever. The door was calling to them, and sooner or later, they would have to answer. Weeks had passed since the Hargreaves family moved to Hillgrove, and the once welcoming home had become a crucible of their growing fears. The knocking from behind the cellar door had evolved. It was no longer content to simply disturb their sleep. Now it seemed to invade their thoughts during the day, an incessant reminder that something lay waiting, wanting. Michael watched as the light in his children's eyes dimmed, the joy of exploring their new home replaced by anxiety. Sarah, steadfast in her resolve, began to unravel. Her nights were spent poring over old town records she'd insisted on checking out from the local library, searching for any clue about their home's past occupants or any incidents that might shed light on their current predicament. On a particularly chilling night, when the wind howled like the cries of the tormented, Michael resolved to end this nightmare. He ventured into the basement, armed with a sledgehammer, determined to tear down the barrier between them and the unknown. Sarah pleaded with him, her voice a mix of fear and desperation, but Michael was adamant. The air grew colder as he approached the door. His hands, though shaking, gripped the tool with a grim finality. The first swing was the hardest. The sound of metal against the aged wood echoed through the house like a gunshot. Tommy and his siblings huddled together at the top of the basement stairs, peering down into the shadowy depths, their young faces stricken with a mixture of fear and anticipation. With each subsequent blow, the knocking grew frenzied, no longer a knock but a pounding, as if a great beast were throwing itself against the door. Michael's determination wavered, the hairs on his neck standing on end, a cold sweat mingling with the dust motes dancing in the air. Then with a splintering crack, the padlock gave way, and the door swung open with an ominous creak that seemed to scream through the silence. An inky darkness poured out from the gap, a darkness so profound it felt alive, reaching out with tendrils of shadow. The Hargreaves peered into the abyss, their breaths held in a collective gasp. The room beyond was not merely a forgotten chamber or a storage closet. It was a gaping maw of history, hunger, and horror. Michael's sledgehammer clattered to the floor, his bravado seeping away as a cold draft emanated from within. A rank, earthy smell assaulted their senses, a mix of mildew and something far less identifiable. The room beckoned, promising answers yet threatening to swallow them whole. Sarah's research had turned up little, but among the fragmented records was a tale of a family that disappeared without a trace. A century prior, their last name worn away by time. The only piece of evidence left behind was a cryptic note, a single line that read, "The knocking began when we opened the door." Now, as they stood on the threshold of revelation, the Hargreaves family faced a choice. They could turn back, try to forget, and possibly move on, or they could step into the dark, confront the source of the knocking, and perhaps unearth truths best left buried. The choice was ripped from them as a sound unlike any other filled the basement. It was a sob, a low moan that twisted into a crescendo of wails and screams echoing from the void. It was a symphony of agony, and within it, they could distinguish voices, cries for help, and pleas for mercy. Michael stepped forward, a protective instinct overriding his terror. He had to know what was inside, had to protect his family from whatever cursed legacy was contained within the cellar. Sarah clutched his arm, her eyes wide with fear, but she nodded. Together they would face whatever haunted their new home. The children, too scared to stay alone, followed closely behind, their small hands clinging to their parents' clothing. The family moved as one, crossing into the cellar, their fates entwined with the heart of Hillgrove's darkest secret. The cellar's air was thick with the weight of undisturbed years, each breath tasting of damp stone and decay. The darkness before the Hargreaves was not just a mere absence of light, but a physical presence that seemed to push back against the glow of the flashlights they held. The walls were lined with shelves covered in a tapestry of dust and cobwebs, housing jars filled with unrecognizable contents, their labels long since faded to nothingness. The floors were a labyrinth of old furniture covered in tarps and boxes stacked haphazardly, as if someone had tried to hide or forget what lay within. As Michael and Sarah, with their children huddled close, ventured deeper, they began to notice something unsettling. Objects scattered around that didn't belong to any era they could identify. A doll with eyes that followed them mournfully, an old-fashioned camera with no lens, a painting of the house with figures in the windows that seemed to move just out of sight. It was then that the sobbing began again, a sorrowful dirge that resonated from the cellar's farthest corner. Drawn to it, they found a small, barricaded door within the cellar, the wood marked by deep gouges, as though something had been trying to break out, or break in. Gathering his courage, Michael moved the debris blocking the door. The sobbing grew louder, more frantic. He hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to flee, to take his family and escape whatever was calling out to them. But he couldn't, not without knowing if the source of their torment was something they could face. With a final push, the door gave way, revealing a narrow tunnel that descended further into the earth, beyond the boundaries of what their house should contain. The sobbing was now accompanied by whispers, a cacophony of voices that beckoned them onward. Driven by a mixture of fear and desperation, the Hargreaves descended. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading them beneath the foundations of their home, into a place that felt older than time itself. As they progressed, the whispers grew into murmurs, recounting tales of sorrow, loss, and regret. They emerged into a cavernous room, the walls etched with strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a sickly light. In the center, a massive stone table dominated the space, surrounded by chairs that looked more like thrones. And upon that table lay a book, its cover worn and pages flickering as if caught in an unfelt breeze. Sarah approached the book, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch it. The moment her skin made contact with the ancient tome, the room was filled with a blinding light, and the whispers crescendoed into clarity. Visions assaulted them. People gathered in this very room, chanting in a language that twisted the air. A ritual performed. A door opened to something that should have remained closed. They saw the previous family, the ones who vanished, caught in the throes of an unimaginable terror. And they understood. The knocking was not a plea for entry, but a warning, a desperate attempt to keep the door sealed. With a gasp, Sarah pulled away from the book, the light dimming and the room returning to oppressive silence. They were not alone. They had never been alone. The spirits of those who had suffered here were bound to the house, their torment a beacon that called to the living, luring them to unearth the truth. Now the Hargreaves knew what lay beneath their home was not merely a cellar, but a prison for something that the rituals had summoned and could not banish. They needed to leave, to escape the fate of those who had come before them. But as they turned to the tunnel that had led them here, they realized it was no longer just a tunnel. It was a throat, and the house was the beast that had swallowed them whole. The realization of their perilous situation settled over the Hargreaves like a shroud. The once mundane cellar had transformed into a nightmarish realm, a place that transcended time and logic. The whispering spirits swirled around them, their voices a mix of warnings and wails of despair. As Michael and Sarah clutched their children close, they understood that their intrusion had stirred the very foundations of this cursed place. The ritual that the previous occupants had conducted was a seal, one they had now unwittingly broken. The air turned frigid, and the darkness seemed to pulsate with malicious intent. From the stone table, the book's pages began to turn of their own accord, stopping on a depiction of a dark figure, its form made of shadows and its eyes like hollow pits. A low growl echoed from the depths of the tunnel, growing louder as the presence they had feared made itself known. A formless shadow emerged, its edges flickering like the flames of an unholy fire. It moved with purpose, its focus solely on the living intruders. Michael stepped forward, his body trembling but his voice steady. He realized they could not outrun this entity. Their only chance was to rebind it to its prison. He demanded that the spirits aid them, invoking the bond of shared humanity and the desire for peace. The spirits, once victims of this horror, converged into a maelstrom of light, clashing with the shadow in a spectacle of otherworldly power. The cellar shook with the force of their battle, stones falling from the ceiling, the earth itself crying out in pain. Sarah, guided by an unseen force, lunged for the book. Her hands danced across the ancient script, and she recited words that she could not understand but felt deep within her soul. With each word spoken, the shadow wailed and recoiled, the spirit's light growing brighter, purer. The children, witnessing the battle, added their voices to their mother's incantations, their innocence and hope acting as a beacon in the darkness. Their combined wills manifested as a shield, protecting their family from the malevolence that sought to consume them. As Sarah reached the climax of the incantation, a blinding explosion of light filled the cavernous cellar, the shockwave throwing them to the ground. Silence followed, a hushed, sacred silence that held the promise of reprieve. They rose, battered but unbroken, to find the shadow gone, the spirits at peace, and the book sealed shut, its cover now blank, as if awaiting a new history to be written. The tunnel had returned to its benign state, a simple passageway leading back to their cellar. They ascended, leaving the depths and their nightmares behind, emerging into the light of dawn that now streamed through the windows of their home. The Hargreaves knew that their lives would never be the same after that night. They had faced the embodiment of fear and had survived. The house on Hillgrove, once a source of dread, became a bastion of their family's strength and unity. The knocking had ceased, for the entity that had haunted the cellar was bound once again, this time with a seal strengthened by the Hargreaves' love and courage. The family remained vigilant, knowing that some doors once opened require constant guardianship. But for now, the darkness had been pushed back, and the light held sway. As they watched the sunrise, Michael, Sarah, and their children embraced, a testament to the enduring power of hope amidst the shadows of the world. Mark had always been a city dweller, but when his job moved him to the quiet suburban town of Elmridge, he thought it might be a nice change. He found a quaint little house with a white picket fence, nestled among a cluster of identical homes on Lilac Lane. There were lush green yards, children's bicycles abandoned on the sidewalk, and a tranquility he hadn't experienced in years. However, the peace didn't last long. As he started his daily morning runs, Mark began to notice an alarming number of missing pet posters plastered around the neighborhood. Dogs, birds, but mostly cats, their images captured mid-yawn or playful leap, stared back at him. The sheer number was unsettling. One evening, after unpacking his last box, Mark decided to take a relaxing walk. The sun had just set, casting long shadows across the pavement, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. He enjoyed these serene moments, the neighborhood bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. But that evening something felt off. As he walked past Mrs. Thompson's house, with its perfectly manicured lawn and kitschy gnome collection, he felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced around, looking for the source of his discomfort. Nothing seemed amiss until he caught a fleeting glimpse of a dark silhouette further down the street. The figure stood still, not making any discernible movements, but Mark felt it, watching him, observing from a distance. Dismissing it as a trick of the light or perhaps a neighbor he hadn't yet met, Mark quickened his pace, eager to get back home. However, every time he glanced over his shoulder, the silhouette seemed to be a little closer, maintaining its eerie vigil. Mark's heart raced, but he made it to his doorstep without incident. He swiftly locked the door behind him and peered through the window blinds. The street outside was empty. The next morning, Mark's beloved cat, Whiskers, was nowhere to be found. He searched the house, calling out, shaking her favorite treat bag. Nothing. Distraught, Mark began knocking on his neighbors' doors, hoping someone had seen her. The responses were a mix of sympathy and knowing glances, but no one had any information. As hours turned to days, Mark grew desperate. It was then that he remembered the silhouette from his nighttime walk. Could there be a connection? Was Whiskers just another face on a missing pet poster? Mark decided to take matters into his own hands. He purchased a set of security cameras and installed them around his house, hoping they'd provide a clue to Whiskers' whereabouts, or at least catch the eerie stalker. That evening, Mark sat down with a cup of tea and began to review the footage. Hours of mundane recordings flashed before his eyes. Kids playing on the street, a car passing by, a bird perched on the mailbox. But as night fell, the footage revealed something horrifying. The dark silhouette returned, pacing slowly outside Mark's house. It stopped frequently, glancing toward the windows, its features indiscernible. And then, in a fleeting moment, it appeared to hold something in its hands, a small, struggling form. Mark's heart sank. It was Whiskers. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The sinister figure had been watching him, and now it had taken something dear to him. Filled with anger and dread, Mark decided he wouldn't stand idly by. He would confront this figure and get Whiskers back. His decision would lead him down a path of dark secrets, hidden right in the heart of Elmridge's tranquil suburbia. The following night, Mark devised a plan. He would set a trap. Mark had an old kennel that he seldom used, so he placed it on the porch with a bowl of Whiskers' favorite food inside, and then hid behind the bushes. Hours passed, his patience thinning and limbs growing sore from crouching. Just as he was about to give up, a faint rustling reached his ears. From the dark corners of the street, the silhouette emerged. Drawn by the smell of the food, it approached the kennel slowly, each step deliberate and predatory. Mark's heart raced as he recognized the same dark figure that had taken Whiskers. Hidden in the bushes, he watched as it cautiously inspected the cage. As it reached a hand inside, Mark lunged forward, tackling the figure to the ground. A struggle ensued, and in the midst of the chaos, a mask fell from the assailant's face, revealing a young woman, no older than 25, with wild, darting eyes. Confused and angered, Mark demanded answers. "Where's Whiskers?" he shouted, pinning her down. The woman, clearly caught off guard, stammered, "You don't understand, I'm trying to protect them." After a tense standoff, Mark reluctantly let her go, sensing there was more to the story. With a hesitant tone, the young woman introduced herself as Lila. She claimed that for years, something sinister resided in Elmeridge. An ancient evil, awakened by unsuspecting town residents decades ago, now demanded regular sacrifices to remain dormant. The creature had a preference for smaller beings, explaining the numerous missing pets in the neighborhood. Lila's family, being descendants of the town's founders, had taken it upon themselves to appease the creature, hoping to prevent it from claiming larger prey. Whiskers, unfortunately, was one such offering. Stunned by the revelation, Mark was torn between fury and disbelief. Yet a part of him knew that she was telling the truth. The overwhelming number of missing pets, the eerie atmosphere, and the dark figure he had seen all pointed to the same chilling reality. Mark needed to see it for himself. Lila, recognizing his determination, decided to lead him to the creature's lair, an underground cavern concealed beneath the town's old well. "But remember," she warned, "once it's awake, there's no guarantee we'll make it out." Descending into the depths, the cold, damp air grew thick with tension. Mark's flashlight beam danced across the cavern walls, revealing petroglyphs that told a chilling tale of rituals and appeasements. As they ventured deeper, an unsettling hum resonated, growing louder with every step. Lila's grip tightened around Mark's arm. They were close. Reaching the heart of the cavern, Mark's light illuminated a large stone altar surrounded by remains of countless animals. Above it, a monstrous, shadowy figure loomed, its form shifting and undulating like smoke. Its crimson eyes focused on the intruders, and with a guttural growl it lunged. The chase was frenetic. Mark and Lila, driven by pure adrenaline, navigated through the labyrinthine tunnels, the creature's echoing roars close behind. Every turn they took, every narrow escape, felt like a dance with death. But Lila, with her intimate knowledge of the maze, managed to lead them to a hidden exit. Bursting into the open air, the two didn't stop running until they reached Mark's house. Breathing heavily and doors securely locked, the gravity of their ordeal began to sink in. Elmeridge was no ordinary town, and its secrets ran deeper than Mark could ever have imagined. Lila, realizing that she couldn't continue her family's dark legacy, decided to leave Elmeridge for good. But before departing, she handed Mark a small amulet. "This," she said, "has been in my family for generations. It's said to ward off evil. Maybe it can protect you." Mark, still processing the night's events, nodded silently. With Whiskers safely back in his arms and the dawn breaking, he pondered his future in Elmeridge. The tranquil facade of the town had been shattered, but perhaps with time, he could find a way to confront and vanquish the ancient evil lurking beneath. Weeks had passed since the terrifying events of that night. Mark's days took on a monotonous routine. His nights, however, were plagued by nightmares of the cavernous monster and its blood-red eyes. The weight of the town's dark secret weighed heavily on him. But with every passing day, his resolve grew stronger. Elmeridge's sinister history couldn't be its future. Determined to fight back, Mark began researching the town's archives. He believed there had to be a way to put an end to the creature's reign. Day after day, Mark would lock himself in the Elmeridge Library's history section, poring over ancient tomes and dusty manuscripts. One evening, Mark stumbled upon an old diary from the town's earliest settler, a woman named Abigail. The diary detailed rituals and symbols used to initially summon and then trap the creature. It spoke of an alliance with neighboring tribes, which combined their spiritual knowledge to create a binding ritual. Mark's heart raced as he realized he might have found the very key to imprisoning the monster once and for all. Assembling a group of trusted town members, including the school librarian, Mrs. Baker, and the local sheriff, Jim, Mark revealed his plan. Both were initially skeptical, but the disappearance of their own pets and the eerie occurrences in town had convinced them that something was amiss. With their help, Mark aimed to reenact the ritual and seal the creature away. The preparations were extensive. They needed rare herbs for the ritual, many of which could only be found in the neighboring woods. Symbols had to be drawn at strategic locations around town. But the most critical component was a powerful crystal, described in Abigail's diary as the heart of Elmridge. This crystal, when infused with the town's collective willpower, could amplify the ritual's potency and bind the creature. Mark and his group were committed and worked tirelessly. While Jim and Mrs. Baker scoured the woods for the essential herbs, Mark searched for the heart of Elmridge. Following clues from the diary, he was led to Elmridge's oldest tree, a massive oak standing solitary on a hill. Beneath its roots, Mark unearthed a shimmering blue crystal, pulsating with energy. With everything in place, the night to perform the ritual arrived. The townspeople gathered in the town square, drawn by rumors and an instinctual understanding of the importance of the night ahead. Lila, hearing of the plan, returned to lend her support, her knowledge of the creature proving invaluable. As Mark began chanting the incantations, the crowd joined in, their collective voice echoing through the night. Lila, Mrs. Baker, and Jim stood at pivotal points, burning the gathered herbs, their smoke forming a thick protective barrier around the town. The heart of Elmridge was placed in the center, its glow intensifying with each passing second. Suddenly, a ground-shaking roar erupted from the direction of the old well. The creature, sensing the threat to its freedom, was on the move. It burst from the ground, its shadowy form even more menacing than before, eyes burning with rage. The town's collective will clashed with the creature's malevolent force. Buildings shook, windows shattered, and the ground trembled under the immense pressure. But Mark, drawing strength from the chanting crowd and the heart of Elmridge, pressed on. With a final deafening scream, a blinding light engulfed the square. When the dust settled, the creature was gone. In its place, the heart of Elmridge floated, now a brilliant shade of white. The town had been saved. The following day saw Elmridge transformed. A newfound unity and purpose bonded the community. The heart was placed in a memorial in the town square, a testament to Elmridge's resilience and the power of collective will. Mark, having faced the depths of his fears and emerged a hero, felt a change within him. He had not only saved his town, but had also found a purpose. With Lila by his side, they embarked on a journey to unearth other town secrets, ensuring that no other community would suffer Elmridge's fate. In the days that followed the dramatic climax in the town square, Elmridge found itself in a state of both disarray and unity. News of the creature and the binding ritual spread rapidly. Surrounding towns sent in reporters, looking for a sensational story, while scholars aimed to study the heart of Elmridge, now a beacon of hope and resilience. Mark found himself at the center of it all. Interviews, talk shows, and even national media outlets were keen on hearing his story. While he was glad the tale was spreading, ensuring that Elmridge's ordeal would not be in vain, the attention was overwhelming. He would often retreat to the solitude of his family's house, where Lila would join him. Together they would reminisce about their childhood, trying to find solace in memories unmarred by the dark shadow of the creature. One evening, Lila handed Mark a worn-out book she had found in her attic. It was another diary, belonging to her great-great-grandmother. Skimming through it, Mark discovered mentions of other towns, other rituals, and other creatures. The world, it seemed, was filled with pockets of darkness, waiting to be exposed. Lila and Mark began considering the idea of traveling together, helping other towns facing supernatural threats. Their shared experience had bonded them in ways neither could have predicted, and they felt a shared responsibility to help others. Meanwhile, Elmridge began its recovery. The town square was renovated, and a statue of the heart of Elmridge was erected as a symbol of the town's strength and unity. The younger generation, inspired by Mark's courage, started community projects aimed at understanding and preserving Elmridge's history. Sheriff Jim, feeling a personal debt to the town for initially doubting Mark's story, was at the forefront of these efforts. He initiated a town-wide effort to create a detailed archive, documenting every family's history, ensuring that no future generation would remain ignorant of the town's legacy. Mrs. Baker, the school librarian with her vast knowledge, was approached by a prestigious university. They wanted her to lead a course on Elmridge's history and its supernatural significance. With a heavy heart, she accepted the offer, leaving Elmridge for the first time in her life. However, She ensured that a part of her remained. Before leaving, she donated her personal collection of rare books and manuscripts to the town library. Months turned into years. Elmridge, once a quiet and unknown town, became a hub for supernatural research. Scholars, students, and tourists flocked to the town, eager to learn about the legendary creature in the heart. Lila and Mark, having traveled across the country, became renowned supernatural experts. They unearthed dark secrets, confronted malevolent entities, and helped countless communities. But Elmridge always remained their home, their anchor. One particular evening, a decade after the events in Elmridge, Mark and Lila returned home, having just resolved a haunting in a distant town. They were tired but fulfilled. As they drove into Elmridge, they passed the town square. The statue of the heart shimmered under the moonlight, a gentle reminder of their beginnings. Pulling over, Mark took Lila's hand. "Do you ever wonder if we did the right thing, exposing all these secrets?" he asked. Lila looked at him, her eyes reflecting the same weariness he felt. "Every time," she admitted. "But then I think of Elmridge. If we hadn't acted, the town would have been consumed. And now, look at it." Mark nodded, understanding her sentiment. It's a heavy burden, knowing so much." Lila squeezed his hand. "But it's our burden, Mark, and together we'll carry it." As dawn began to break, casting a soft golden hue over Elmridge, Mark and Lila drove off, ready to face another day, another challenge. Their journey had just begun. The cold October wind howled through the streets of Davenport, rustling the crisp fallen leaves into frenetic dances. Under the watchful gaze of a crescent moon, a group of teenagers gathered at the outskirts of Hollow Creek, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. Alex, a reluctant participant, stood among them, wrapped in the safety of his friend's laughter, which cut through the chilly air like a warm blade. "Dude, are you seriously chicken?" teased Mark, a lanky boy with a mischievous glint in his eyes. "It's just a bunch of stupid Halloween stories. The Craven House, the witch's curse, it's all crap made to scare kids." Alex felt his pride sting. He wasn't a believer in the supernatural, but something about Hollow Creek set his nerves on edge. It wasn't just the dilapidated houses that seemed to leer with unseen eyes, or the unsettling stillness that blanketed the area. It was the stories that had woven themselves into the fabric of Davenport's history, the tale of the witch who had cursed the land when her child disappeared on Halloween night many years ago. "All right, fine," Alex retorted, the words sharp with feigned confidence. "Let's just get this over with. The sooner we prove there's nothing here, the better." The teens had set the rules for the dare. Each must walk the entirety of Hollow Creek, trick or treat at every hauntingly silent house, and whoever reached the Craven House at the end of the lane would be crowned the bravest, or the most foolish. Legend had it that the witch granted one wish to those who proved their courage on this night. Clad in their costumes, they looked like a motley crew of horror movie stereotypes: a vampire, a ghost, a zombie, and Alex, who'd begrudgingly donned the hat and sword of a pirate. They approached the first house, its windows dark, the only light coming from a jack-o'-lantern whose grin seemed to mock their venture. The night progressed, and with each ring of a doorbell, they were greeted by odd characters. There was the woman with hair as white as the moonlight, her eyes milky and distant, who handed them candies that squirmed in their wrappers. Then the tall man with a top hat, whose shadow seemed to stretch too far into the darkness, offering them apples that felt unnaturally warm to the touch. Despite the eerie encounters, the group's laughter grew louder, fueled by adrenaline and the relief that came with each uneventful trick-or-treat. That is, until they turned the corner onto Elm Street, where the true heart of Hollow Creek began to show its twisted visage. There, floating at the street's end, was the outline of a child in a ghost costume. Its movements were unnatural, as if carried by an unseen current of air rather than feet. Alex's breath caught in his throat, and he exchanged a look of concern with his friends. They'd all seen it, the ghost that wasn't quite a ghost, a specter that beckoned them forward with a silent, ethereal hand. "Are you seeing this?" whispered Sophie, her voice a tremulous note of awe and fear. They followed, drawn by the mystery and the thrill, the legend of Hollow Creek pulsing through their veins like a living thing. As they neared the Craven house, a sense of vertigo took hold, the world tilting on an unseen axis. The streetlights flickered, casting shadows that twisted and turned in a maddening dance. Time seemed to stretch and compress, distorting their senses until they stood, disoriented and panting, at the edge of the Craven house's lawn. The child in the ghost costume stood before the wrought iron gate, its head tilting to the side as if to invite them in. Then, with the blink of an eye, it vanished, leaving behind the echo of a child's giggle that was swallowed by the night. Alex's heart hammered in his chest, a rhythm that matched the others. This was no longer a simple dare. Hollow Creek had accepted their challenge, and the night was only just beginning to unveil its true, unforgiving nature. The group stood frozen, eyes wide as they stared at the spot where the spectral child had disappeared. The gate to the Craven house groaned as a gust of wind pushed it open, as if inviting them inside. The house loomed before them, its decrepit exterior bathed in the weak moonlight, windows like darkened eyes watching their every move. "This is insane," Sophie breathed out, her earlier excitement now replaced with palpable fear. "Maybe we should just go back." "No, we can't," Alex said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We've come this far. Besides, if the stories are true, we could get a wish. We could wish for, I don't know, something great." The allure of a wish hung in the air, heavier than the mist that began to creep along the ground. It was a chance to make their bravest dreams, or darkest desires, come true. They pushed through the gate, the metallic screech echoing through the night like a foreboding cry. As they approached the front door, the whispers started, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but growing in intensity until words began to form, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Leave. Do not want. Beware." The words slithered around them, cold and menacing, and it took all of Alex's willpower not to run. They reached the door, its old wood etched with symbols that none of them recognized, symbols that seemed to move in the corner of their eyes. Mark, ever the defiant one, reached out and grabbed the iron door knocker, shaped like a snarling beast, and let it fall with a thunderous boom that seemed to shake the very earth. The door swung open, revealing a darkness that was absolute, a void that beckoned them forward. With only their flashlights to guide them, they entered the Craven house. The air was thick, making each breath a laborious task. The beams of their lights flickered over antique furniture covered in dust, cobwebs that hung like drapes, and paintings that watched them with eyes that seemed to follow their every step. The whispers grew louder, turning into voices that called out to them. Alex's name echoed in his ears, making him whirl around, but there was nothing behind him. Only the emptiness of the house and the dim outline of his friends. They moved deeper into the house, towards the grand staircase that led to the upper floors. Each step creaked under their weight, as if the house itself was groaning in protest. They could feel it now, the house pulsing with a life of its own, a heartbeat that thrummed through the soles of their shoes. When they reached the top, they found themselves in a hallway lined with doors. The voices were clearer now, each one distinct. "Help me. I'm so cold. Mommy, where are you?" It was the voice of a child, and it pulled at Alex's heartstrings. Without thinking, he moved toward the sound, his friend's warnings drowned out by the plaintive cries. He opened the door from where the voice seemed to be emanating, and the sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. The room was a child's nursery, untouched by time. Toys were scattered on the floor. A rocking horse moved back and forth by some unseen force, and in the corner, a crib with its bars gnawed and bent outward. In the crib lay a doll, its face twisted into an eternal scream. Suddenly, the room filled with a cold so intense it burned, and the voices crescendo into a deafening roar. From the shadows, a figure emerged, cloaked in darkness, its eyes two glowing embers of hate. It was the witch of Hollow Creek, her curse as alive today as it had been all those years ago. "You dare seek a wish?" The witch hissed, her voice like the scratching of claws on wood. "Then a wish you shall have. But know this, there is always a price to pay. The temperature plummeted further, and a thick darkness began to seep from the walls, enveloping them in a blanket of fear. Alex's heart pounded in his chest, the witch's curse wrapping around them like chains. The group huddled together, their earlier bravado shattered by the reality of their situation. They had sought a thrill, a story to tell in hushed tones and with boastful laughter. Instead, they had found a nightmare that threatened to consume them, a terror that was all too real. They had to make a wish, to try and end this horror. But what wish could possibly combat the malevolence that threatened to engulf them? And what would be the price they had to pay? The Craven house held its breath, waiting for their choice, as the witch's laughter echoed through the halls, a sound that promised nothing but despair. Panic clawed at their chests. Each breath they drew was a struggle against the suffocating darkness. Sophie, tears streaming down her face, clutched at Alex's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Make a wish, Alex, do something," she pleaded, her voice a terrified whisper that cut through the witch's cackling. But wishes were for fairy tales, and this was a nightmare. The witch advanced, her form blurring and shifting, a specter of rage and malice. "Choose," she screeched, her voice a vortex sucking at their sanity. In the face of abject horror, Alex's mind raced. What could he wish for? Salvation? Escape? He closed his eyes and the answer came. A wish not for himself, but for the lost souls this house had consumed. "I wish for their peace," he shouted into the dark. The house shuddered, as if the very foundation rebelled against the notion. A silence descended, the witch's laughter cut off, the child's cries stilled. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. The darkness held its breath. Then the toys in the nursery began to float, surrounded by a faint glow. The spectral child appeared once more, its eyes wide with wonder rather than fear. Other spirits began to materialize throughout the house, faces of sorrow that had long been trapped in the witch's cruel grip. The witch's form wavered, her cloak of shadows unraveling. "You dare to defy my curse?" she howled, but her voice was weakening, the sound of wind through dead leaves. With every spirit that rose, the witch's presence dimmed. A cacophony of voices filled the air, not with despair, but with thanks. "Freedom," they whispered. "Release." Alex's group, encircled by the spirits, watched in awe as the nursery's chill gave way to a warmth like the kiss of the sun after a long winter. The doll in the crib's face smoothed into a tranquil expression. The rocking horse stilled. The witch, now no more than a wisp of smoke, gave one final scream before she evaporated, her essence scattering like ash on the wind. The Craven house, once a prison of pain, shone with a light pure and cleansing. The curse was broken, their fear forgotten, the friends embraced, laughing with a delirium that bordered on madness. They had come for a thrill and had become unwitting heroes in a story that would be passed down through the ages. The house around them creaked and groaned, its structure settling as though it too could finally rest. And rest they did, amid the remnants of a horror that would never again claim another soul. The night waned, and with the first rays of dawn, the spirits faded, leaving behind a serene silence that spoke of a long-awaited peace. Alex and his friends exited the house, stepping out into the cool morning air. They looked back at the Craven house one last time, now just an old building, its menace gone with the night. They left with no tangible reward, no riches or glory, but they carried with them the knowledge that they had faced the heart of darkness and had emerged not just unscathed, but triumphant. The first blush of dawn painted the horizon in hues of rose and gold as Alex and his friends stumbled from the threshold of Craven house, the ordeal behind them casting a surreal glow on their reality. They had survived a night that transcended the boundaries of their understanding, a harrowing confrontation with a malevolence that had, until that night, only existed in hushed tales and the annals of local legend. The town was waking up, its inhabitants unaware of the monumental shift that had occurred within the crumbling walls of the town's most infamous landmark. Alex glanced back at the house, half expecting to see the witch glaring at them from one of the broken windows, or to feel the chill of her curse nipping at their heels. But there was nothing. Just an old house, silent and oddly respectful in the light of the new day. They didn't speak much on the way back to their own homes. What words could adequately encompass what they had experienced? They each bore the weight of the night differently, etched into their faces and settling into their bones. Alex's parents were already up, the familiar sounds of breakfast being prepared drifting through the house as he entered. "You're back late," his mother chided gently, but her eyes widened in concern at the sight of him. "What happened?" He shook his head, not yet ready to attempt an explanation. "Just a long night," he muttered, escaping upstairs to the sanctuary of his room. Sleep was elusive. Every time Alex closed his eyes, the echoes of the spirit's gratitude, the witch's wails, and the ethereal glow of release played behind his eyelids. As the sun climbed higher, streaming through his window, he finally drifted into a fitful doze, where the haunting events continued to replay. The news of Craven House's transformation spread through the town like wildfire. Without the oppressive aura of the witch's curse, the house was just a structure, albeit one with a notorious past. Soon there was talk of renovation, of repurposing the building, of moving forward. Weeks turned into months. The group, their bond cemented by the shared trauma and triumph, met often, but they spoke little of that night. Instead, they focused on the future, on college applications, on the final year of high school. Life moved on as it inevitably does, but the shadow of that night lingered in their hearts, a dark backdrop to their youthful optimism. Craven House was renovated, turned into a community center, a place of laughter and life, where once there had been only pain and suffering. It stood as a testament to the town's resilience, to the idea that even the darkest past could be overcome. Alex visited sometimes, drawn by a mix of nostalgia and a need for closure. He would stand in the nursery, now a brightly lit classroom, and remember the ghostly child who had played with spectral toys. He'd smile, knowing that they had found peace, that their souls were no longer bound to the witch's bitterness. The final remnants of fear dissipated, replaced by a sense of purpose. The friends grew up, as children do, shaped in part by the night they spent in Craven House. They went off to college, started careers, and built lives. But every year on the anniversary of that night, they returned to the community center. They'd gather in the nursery, where the worst of the horror had unfolded, and they'd raise a toast, not to the terror they'd faced, but to the spirits they'd freed. And sometimes, just sometimes, they'd swear they could hear the faintest whisper of gratitude, a soft thank you carried on the wind, from souls who had once been lost, but were now eternally at rest. David had always been an optimist. It was why, even after the passing of his wife and the subsequent challenges life had thrown at him, he remained hopeful. The small inheritance left to him became a beacon of hope, an opportunity to start afresh. He stumbled upon the listing while browsing online. The property was in a quaint town named Everwood, far removed from the bustling city's sounds and sights. The description boasted of a grand old house that had character and history. And the price? Suspiciously low. Must be a mistake, David thought. But it wasn't. The realtor, a short woman with fiery red hair, hesitated when David mentioned the property. "Ah, the old miller's residence," she said, her eyes darting away. When pressed, she just mentioned that it had been on the market for a long while, and many were wary of older houses and their required upkeep. The drive to Everwood took them through winding roads, flanked by tall trees that seemed to whisper secrets to each other. David's daughter, Emma, plugged into her headphones, occasionally glanced out, an unspoken melancholy in her eyes. As they pulled up to the house, David felt a flutter in his stomach. The house was majestic, a remnant from another era with tall spires, a broad front porch, and ivy creeping up its brick walls. Yet it had a forlorn look, windows like hollow eyes staring blankly ahead. "This is big," Emma remarked, pulling out her earbuds. David chuckled. "Space for all your teenage angst?" She rolled her eyes but smiled faintly. That night, as David lay in bed, the house's silence was punctuated by its many sounds, creaking floorboards, the soft rustle of curtains, and whispers. At first he thought he was dreaming, but as he strained his ears, he realized the sound was real, though he couldn't decipher the words. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. He got up thinking Emma might be playing some prank, or maybe it was just the wind. As he neared her room, he noticed her door ajar and the soft glow of her lamp spilling out. Pushing it open gently, he found Emma sitting up, her face pale. "Did you hear it too?" she whispered. David nodded, sitting beside her. "Probably just the house settling in. Old houses, you know. They have their quirks." But Emma wasn't convinced. It felt like someone was talking, just out of earshot. David hugged her. "First nights in new places are always weird. It'll get better." But even as he said it, the soft, indistinct whispers continued, echoing softly in the vast emptiness of their new home. The next morning, as David made breakfast, he tried to brush off the previous night's events. Maybe it was just the stress of the move, combined with the age of the house playing tricks on them. But when he saw Emma at the table, dark circles under her eyes, he felt a pang of worry. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, pushing her cereal around. "Every time I closed my eyes, I felt watched." David frowned. "Maybe we can get someone to take a look. A priest, or maybe someone who knows about these kinds of things." Emma gave a weak smile. "Ghostbusters, Dad." But as the day wore on, the odd occurrences didn't stop. Doors would shut on their own, lights would flicker, and once, David swore he heard a child's laughter echoing through the halls. They decided to head into town to gather some essentials and perhaps learn more about their new home. Everwood was small, with streets lined with tiny shops, and at its center, a town square where a group of elderly people sat playing chess and chatting. While Emma browsed a bookstore, David struck up a conversation with an old man named Albert, who seemed to be a local historian of sorts. "Oh, the old Miller house?" Albert's eyes widened in recognition. "You moved there?" David nodded. "Do you know anything about it?" Albert hesitated before beginning. "That house has history. The Millers were one of the founding families of Everwood. But in the late 1800s, tragedy struck. Their only son, Benjamin, disappeared without a trace. The town searched high and low but found no sign of him. Some said he was taken by wild animals. Others whispered about a darker fate." David felt a chill. "And the whispers? The strange occurrences?" Albert looked uncomfortable. "People said the house was haunted, that Benjamin's spirit couldn't find peace. The Millers eventually moved away, but no one stayed in that house for long. Folks claimed they'd hear a child's laughter, footsteps in empty rooms, doors slamming on their own." David's heart sank. "Why didn't the realtor mention any of this?" Albert shrugged. "Who'd buy a haunted house?" As they drove back, the house seemed even more imposing. David felt a weight of unease settle in. He couldn't, in good conscience, let Emma stay in a place that was unsettling, potentially dangerous. That night, the disturbances grew worse. The whispers were louder, almost like a chorus of voices, unintelligible but persistent. As David tried to comfort a visibly shaken Emma, a loud crash echoed from downstairs. Racing down, they found a portrait, one that David hadn't noticed before. Lying shattered on the ground, it depicted a family, and at its center, a young boy with piercing blue eyes that bore an uncanny resemblance to the ones David saw staring back at him from the darkness. The gravity of their situation had never felt so palpable. With every unsettling event, the walls of the Miller house seemed to close in around David and Emma. David knew they couldn't just pack up and leave, especially with all the money invested. But the safety and sanity of his daughter was paramount. Late that night, with Emma safely asleep in her room, David began scouring the internet for any mention of paranormal specialists. He stumbled across a forum where locals shared tales of the unexplained in Everwood. One name repeatedly came up: Dr. Eleanor Gray, a parapsychologist who had supposedly helped many in town with their supernatural predicaments. Wasting no time, David reached out to Dr. Gray, explaining their situation. To his surprise, she responded almost instantly, indicating she was well acquainted with the Miller house and its unsavory reputation. By the following afternoon, Dr. Gray, a tall woman with silver streaks in her raven black hair, stood in their living room. She had a stern but kind face and moved with a grace and confidence that momentarily put David at ease. "We'll start with a tour," she said, pulling out an assortment of tools that David couldn't begin to understand. As they moved through the house, Dr. Gray would pause occasionally, her brow furrowing in concentration. In Benjamin's old room, the epicenter of the disturbances, she lingered longest. "The energy here is dense," she remarked. "There's sorrow, confusion, but also anger." David swallowed hard. Can you help us?" Dr. Gray nodded. "But first we must understand the source of this haunting." The research was exhaustive. Dr. Gray delved into town records, newspaper archives, and conducted interviews with the few remaining elders who might have first-hand accounts. With David's help, a clearer picture of the past began to emerge. They discovered that Benjamin wasn't the only child to vanish in Everwood around that time. Several children had disappeared over a span of a few years, all under mysterious circumstances, and the epicenter of these disappearances was invariably close to the Miller property. One evening, as David was poring over an old map of the town, a realization struck him. All the locations where the children were last seen formed a pattern. They were all in a direct line leading to an old well at the edge of the Miller property, long since boarded up and forgotten. With trepidation, David and Dr. Gray decided to investigate the well the next dawn. As dawn broke, David and Dr. Gray stood before the old well. Its wooden cover had decayed, masked by overgrown weeds, suggesting it had been untouched for decades. The morning mist seemed to dance eerily around it, amplifying the tension in the air. Dr. Gray reached into her bag, pulling out a small, ornate-looking pendant. She explained it acted as a compass for spiritual energy. Holding it above the well, it began to spin frantically. "The energy is strongest here," she whispered. Taking a deep breath, David pried the wooden planks away, revealing the dark abyss below. Without a word, Dr. Gray tied a rope to a nearby tree, signaling for David to do the same on the opposite side. Together, they created a makeshift pulley. "Are you sure about this?" David questioned, hesitance evident in his voice. "We have to uncover the truth," she replied, determination shining in her eyes. David descended first, the weight of darkness pressing on him as he went deeper. The dank smell of mold and stagnant water filled his nostrils. His flashlight revealed the slimy walls of the well, the beam reflecting off something further down. Bones. As he touched ground, he realized the bottom of the well was a mass grave. Tiny skeletal remains, remnants of the missing children, lay interwoven, their last moments likely filled with terror. Dr. Gray soon joined him, her eyes wide in horror. Among the bones, she found a locket containing an old photograph. It was a younger version of Benjamin with a woman David recognized as Abigail, the previous owner of the house. A chilling note inside read, "We'll be together forever." David's heart raced as he pieced together the horrifying truth. Abigail had been in love with Benjamin. In a twisted act of passion, she lured him and the other children to their doom, believing their young souls would keep her beloved Benjamin company in death. The duo knew they had to put the restless souls to peace. With Dr. Gray guiding the process, they performed a cleansing ritual, praying for the departed, asking for forgiveness, and ensuring they moved on from this realm. Emerging from the well, the atmosphere felt lighter, the malevolent presence absent. The house, which once held an air of foreboding, now seemed just like any other. Dr. Gray departed, leaving David and Emma to rebuild their lives. The horrors of the past were finally put to rest, and the father-daughter duo could look forward to peaceful days and nights in their home. But as they say, some evils lurk, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The small town of Ashbrook was hardly the place you'd expect to find a state-of-the-art wax museum. Nestled between sprawling hills and dense forests, it was the kind of town most people passed without a second glance. However, it wasn't the scenic beauty that had brought Jonah and his friends to this remote location. Jonah, an aficionado of the macabre, had caught wind of an exhibition that promised an experience like no other. The online forum he frequented was buzzing with rumors of this museum's lifelike statues and its mysterious owner. The most compelling story, however, was that of two visitors who'd supposedly gone missing after their visit. "Are you sure this is the place?" Sarah asked skeptically, as their car pulled into the near-empty parking lot of the Ashbrook Wax Museum. "It has to be," replied Jonah with a twinkle in his eye. He was always up for an adventure, and the more eerie, the better. Mark chuckled. "Yeah, the place where people disappear. Sounds like a 5-star tourist attraction." Ava shushed him. "Come on, Mark, we're here now, might as well make the most of it." As they entered, the interior was dimly lit, casting eerie shadows on the wax figures. The museum seemed to chronicle the town's history, from its founding fathers to notable residents. Yet there was a palpable tension in the air. Whether it was the lifelike precision of the statues or the chilling quietness, it felt as though the figures were watching, waiting. Jonah was in his element, moving from one exhibit to the next, reading out snippets of history to the group. Sarah, ever the photographer, was snapping pictures, while Ava looked around uneasily. Mark, trying to lighten the mood, would strike poses next to the figures, making faces. It was during one of these goofy stints that Mark noticed a curtain tucked away in a corner with a sign reading, "Coming soon." "Hey guys, want to see what's behind the curtain?" he whispered with a mischievous grin. Sarah rolled her eyes. "You're going to get us kicked out." But curiosity had gripped them all. Jonah nodded. "Let's take a quick look." Pulling the curtain aside, the group was met with a chilling sight. There under the spotlight were two figures, a man and a woman, posed as though they were mid-conversation. The shock wasn't just how real they looked, but who they resembled. "Isn't that—" Ava trailed off, her voice trembling. "Peter and Laura," Sarah whispered, "the couple from their hometown who'd gone missing a month ago. They were reported last seen heading towards Ashbrook." Heart-pounding, Jonah approached the exhibit, reaching out to touch Laura's waxen face. It felt cold, eerily smooth. "This can't be," he muttered. They were startled by a slow clap. Turning around, they saw an old man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. Dressed in an old-fashioned suit, he looked like he belonged to a different era. "Mr. Graves," he introduced himself with a slight bow. "The owner of this fine establishment. I see you've found our newest exhibit. A remarkable likeness, isn't it?" "How did you—" Jonah began, but the words caught in his throat. Mr. Graves smiled, revealing a set of unnaturally white teeth. "I have my sources, and as you can see, my work is unparalleled." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Mark, trying to diffuse the tension, laughed. "Well, you've certainly got a talent for making things lifelike." Mr. Graves simply smiled. "Enjoy the rest of your visit, and remember, no touching the exhibits." The friends quickly moved away, the atmosphere now thick with unease. They decided to cut their visit short. However, as they approached the exit, a crack of thunder echoed through the town. Rain lashed down, making it impossible to leave. "It looks like we're stuck here," said Jonah, peering out. Mark groaned. Of all the places. Little did they know that their night at the museum was about to take a sinister turn. The rain outside showed no sign of letting up, the droplets pelting against the windows like tiny fists. The four of them were huddled in the museum's lobby, watching as the electricity flickered, the dim lighting growing even more precarious. Jonah tried the main door, hoping to get a cell signal outside, but found it locked. "That's odd," he murmured. Sarah looked up from her camera, reviewing the photos she'd taken. "Maybe there's a back door or something. We can't stay here all night." Ava nodded in agreement. "I'm not a fan of this place, especially after seeing that display." Mark, trying to lift the mood, said, "Oh, come on. It's just a wax museum. What's the worst that could happen?" A loud crash echoed through the museum, causing them to jump. The sound seemed to come from one of the exhibit rooms. "What the hell was that?" Mark whispered, regretting his previous bravado. Without waiting, Jonah led the way towards the sound, hoping it might be an exit or a staff member who could help. As they traversed the dim hallways, each wax figure seemed more sinister, their painted eyes tracking every movement. In the History of Ashbrook exhibit, a large glass display had shattered. Inside, there was a wax figure of a miner, but it now lay on the ground. as if it had tried to break free. The pickaxe, which was previously in its hand, was missing. "That's not right," Sarah murmured, snapping a photo. Mark gulped. "Who would do that?" Before anyone could answer, a shadow darted past the entrance to the room. Ava screamed, pointing. "There! Did you see that?" Jonah, trying to remain calm, said, "It's probably Mr. Graves. Let's find him and figure out how to get out of here." As they continued their search, they came across a room labeled Workshop. Curiosity piqued. They entered, hoping to find clues. Inside, the room was a mess. Molds, sculpting tools, and unfinished wax figures littered the place. Sarah, looking closely at one of the molds, gasped, "Guys, this looks like an actual face imprint." Ava looked horrified. "You mean like a cast of a real person?" Jonah didn't want to believe it, but connecting the dots in his mind, the evidence seemed clear. The lifelike figures, the missing couple resembling the statues, and now this. A noise from the corner of the room drew their attention. There in the shadows stood Mr. Graves, the missing pickaxe in his hand. "Such a curious bunch," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "I didn't expect you to discover my workshop. No matter. You'll make fine additions to my collection." With that, he lunged at them, pickaxe swinging. Mark, thinking quickly, grabbed a canister of sculpting fluid and threw it at Mr. Graves, temporarily blinding him. The group bolted from the room, trying to find a way out. Their hearts pounded as they raced through the museum. Everywhere they turned, wax figures seemed to be reaching out, their still faces mocking the group's desperation. They finally found themselves in a grand ballroom exhibit. In the center stood a magnificent chandelier. As they ran towards the exit, Mr. Graves appeared, cutting them off. Jonah, desperate, hurled a chair at the chandelier's chain. It crashed down, creating a barrier between them and their pursuer. Seizing the moment, they dashed through a side door, finding themselves outside in the rain, free from the museum's haunting grip. Without looking back, they ran towards their car, the tires screeching as they sped away from the horrors of the Ashbrook Wax Museum. Safe in their motel room, the four friends tried to process what had just happened. The room was dimly lit, the soft hum of the television in the background, and the rain still pattering against the window. Jonah sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his temples. "We need to go to the police. That man is dangerous." Sarah was scrolling through her photos, her face pale. "Look at this." She showed the others a blurry photo of a figure standing behind a wax statue. The details were unclear, but there was something off about the figure. Mark squinted. "That looks like the missing couple." Ava shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. "This can't be real. It's like some twisted horror movie." Mark put his arm around Ava, trying to comfort her. "We'll figure it out. Let's just make it through the night and get to the police in the morning." Sarah frowned. "Wait a second, I have an idea." She connected her camera to the motel's TV and began browsing through her photos, zooming in on specific images. One image stood out, a framed newspaper clipping on the museum's wall titled, "The Mine Collapse Tragedy of Ashbrook." Jonah read aloud. In 1912, an unexpected mine collapse in Ashbrook trapped and killed 23 miners. Their bodies, buried deep beneath the earth, were never recovered. Mark made the connection. And that wax figure of the miner, with the pickaxe. Sarah nodded grimly. "I think Mr. Graves, or whoever he truly is, has a dark connection to that tragedy." Jonah continued reading. "Legend says that the trapped souls still wander the mines, seeking revenge on those above ground." The friends realized that their lives were still in danger. They weren't just dealing with a deranged man, but potentially vengeful spirits bound to the land by tragedy. Suddenly, the lights in the motel flickered, and the TV screen turned to static. A cold breeze swept through the room, despite all windows being closed. The faint sound of mining drills echoed, growing louder. Mark whispered, "They're here." Without warning, the room's door burst open, and dark, shadowy figures flooded in. The figures looked like miners with soot-covered faces and vacant eyes, wielding old mining tools. Ava screamed, "We need to leave now." Jonah, thinking quickly, remembered seeing an old salt circle protection ritual in one of the museum exhibits. Grabbing the salt shaker from the motel's mini kitchen, he quickly formed a circle around them. The figures, unable to cross the salt barrier, became increasingly aggressive, their haunting chants filling the room. The friends held hands, bracing themselves. As dawn approached, the figures slowly started to fade away, their chants growing weaker. When the first ray of sunlight peeked through the window, the room returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. Sarah, tears streaming down her face, said, "We need to end this. We need to free those souls." Jonah nodded. "We have to return to the mines." The following day, the four friends ventured to the abandoned mines on the outskirts of Ashbrook. The entrance was concealed by overgrown foliage, but a faint path revealed frequent foot traffic, possibly from Mr. Graves or other curious souls. Sarah had brought her camera along, hoping to document their experience. Inside the mine, the temperature dropped considerably. The only light came from the flashlights they carried and the occasional glow of Sarah's camera. The walls whispered of ancient tales, and the weight of the tragedy that befell the miners was palpable. Jonah, being somewhat familiar with old mine layouts from his research, led the group deeper into the winding tunnels. There should be a central chamber, maybe a gathering spot for the miners, he mused. As they walked, Mark found old newspaper clippings and artifacts strewn about, possibly from Mr. Graves's collection. One such item was an aged journal presumably belonging to a miner. It chronicled the days leading up to the collapse, and the last entry spoke of a foreboding feeling in the air. Reaching the central chamber, they discovered an old altar, with 23 candles placed in a circle, one for each trapped miner. The center held a pickaxe, eerily similar to the one seen with the wax statue. Realizing they had a limited window before the spirits returned, Ava proposed a plan. "We need to light these candles, pay our respects, and free these souls." Jonah began reciting an old miner's prayer he'd found during his research. As the words left his lips and the candles were lit one by one, the atmosphere grew heavy. Suddenly, the spirits of the miners appeared, surrounding them in a spectral dance of anger and sorrow. But as the prayer reached its climax, a blinding light radiated from the altar. The spirits, no longer bound by their tragedy, began ascending upwards, finally finding peace. However, the ordeal wasn't over. A chilling scream echoed through the mine. Mr. Graves, eyes wild with fury, charged at them, wielding the same pickaxe from the museum. Mark, thinking quickly, grabbed the miner's journal and hurled it at Mr. Graves, momentarily disorienting him. Ava, seizing the opportunity, pushed the altar, causing it to crash onto Mr. Graves, pinning him down. The friends made a run for the mine's exit, with the echoing screams of Mr. Graves slowly fading behind them. Emerging into daylight, they took a moment to catch their breath. Sarah, trembling, whispered, "We did it. We freed them." Jonah nodded, "But we can never forget what happened here." The four friends, forever bonded by their harrowing experience, decided to erect a memorial near the mine entrance. It served as a reminder of the tragedy, the souls they freed, and the day they faced pure evil and emerged victorious. Well, there you have it, folks. A tale that might just keep you up tonight. If you dare to hear more stories that go bump in the night, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you won't miss out on any of our haunting adventures. Give this video a thumbs up if it sent a chill down your spine, and share it with those who could use a little scare. Remember, some stories are just tales, while others, well, let's just say you might want to keep that nightlight on. See you in the next video if you dare. Until then, sweet nightmares.